The emergence of the Sarmatian peoples from the vast expanses of the Pontic-Caspian steppes represents one of the most significant ethnogenetic processes in ancient Eurasian history. Archaeological excavations across the region, stretching from the Don River to the Ural Mountains, have revealed a complex tapestry of cultural transformation that began in the 7th century BC, marking the gradual evolution of what would become one of antiquity's most formidable nomadic confederations. The material culture that archaeologists identify as distinctly Sarmatian first appeared in burial complexes along the lower Volga River around 650 BC. These early kurgans, or burial mounds, display a fascinating amalgamation of inherited Scythian traditions and innovative cultural elements that would come to define Sarmatian civilization. The grave goods from sites such as Blumenfeld and Süssli reveal bronze cauldrons with distinctive zoomorphic handles, iron weapons featuring unique decorative motifs, and horse harness fittings that demonstrate both continuity with earlier steppe traditions and mark departures in artistic expression. The transition from Scythian to Sarmatian material culture was not abrupt, but rather represented a gradual process of cultural synthesis spanning nearly 2 centuries. Excavations at the Filipovka cemetery complex have yielded particularly illuminating evidence of this transformation. The site contains burials dating from the 6th to 4th centuries BC, showing a clear evolution in burial practices, weapon types, and decorative arts. Early Sarmatian graves maintained the Scythian practice of burying horses alongside warriors, but introduced new elements such as tamgus carved into metal objects and a distinctive style of polychrome jewellery featuring garnet and glass inlays. The pottery assemblages from these early Sarmatian sites demonstrate technological innovations that distinguish them from their Scythian predecessors. Hand-built vessels with distinctive rim profiles and surface treatments appear consistently across Sarmatian territories, suggesting the development of shared cultural norms across geographically dispersed communities. The ceramic evidence indicates that Sarmatian potters developed new firing techniques that produced harder, more durable vessels suitable for the demands of increased mobility. Archaeological evidence also reveals significant changes in settlement patterns during this formative period. While Scythian communities had maintained semi-permanent settlements with substantial earthwork fortifications, early Sarmatian sites show a marked preference for temporary camps with minimal architectural investment. Excavations at sites like Kalinovka have uncovered circular arrangements of post holes indicating portable structures, along with large quantities of animal bones suggesting intensive livestock management. This shift in settlement archaeology reflects the Sarmatians' adaptation to a more thoroughly nomadic lifestyle. The linguistic evidence for Sarmatian origins provides crucial insights into the ethnogenetic processes occurring in the Pontic-Caspian steppes during this period. Sarmatian belonged to the Eastern Iranian branch of the Indo-European language family, sharing common ancestry with Scythian, but developing distinct phonological and morphological characteristics that set it apart from its steppe predecessors. Comparative linguistic analysis of Sarmatian personal names, tribal ethnonyms, and loanwords, preserved in Greek and Latin sources, reveals systematic sound changes that occurred during the 6th and 5th centuries BC. The relationship between Sarmatian and Scythian languages appears to have been one of dialectal divergence, rather than complete linguistic replacement. Both languages shared the Eastern Iranian innovation of converting Proto-Iranian through clusters to a CE, distinguishing them from Western Iranian languages like Old Persian. However, Sarmatian developed unique features such as the retention of certain Proto-Iranian vowel qualities that were lost in Scythian, and distinctive patterns of consonant cluster simplification that would later influence the development of Alanic dialects. Personal names preserved in Greek inscriptions from the Black Sea colonies provide valuable evidence for Sarmatian linguistic development. Names such as Aspergus, Rhodamsides, and Pharasmanes demonstrate characteristic Sarmatian phonological features, including the development of th2*rd and the preservation of certain diphthongs that had monophthongized in related Iranian languages. The onomastic evidence suggests that Sarmatian had developed into a distinct language by the 5th century BC, though mutual intelligibility with Scythian likely persisted for several generations. The tribal confederations that emerged during the early Sarmatian period reflect complex processes of political and social reorganization occurring across the steppes. The earliest historical sources identify several major Sarmatian groupings, including the Sarmati along the lower Volga, the Siraces in the Kuban region, and the Aorsi controlling territories between the Don and Volga rivers. These confederations were not static political entities, but rather fluid alliances of kinship groups that could expand, contract, or reorganize in response to changing circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests that the formation of these tribal confederations was closely linked to the development of specialized pastoral economies. Faunal remains from Sarmatian sites show a marked increase in horse breeding compared to earlier periods, with horses comprising up to 40% of livestock assemblages at some sites. This intensive horse breeding supported not only military activities, but also the production of mare's milk products that became staples of Sarmatian diet and trade networks. The transition to fully nomadic pastoralism represented a fundamental reorganization of Sarmatian society that occurred gradually between the 6th and 4th centuries BC. Earlier semi-nomadic communities had practiced seasonal mobility while maintaining permanent base camps, but fully nomadic groups abandoned fixed settlements entirely in favour of year-round movement following optimal grazing conditions. This transformation required sophisticated knowledge of grassland ecology, weather patterns, and seasonal migration routes that were encoded in oral traditions and passed down through generations. The development of nomadic pastoralism among the Sarmatians was facilitated by innovations in portable technology that enhanced mobility without sacrificing material comfort. Archaeological evidence reveals the development of collapsible wooden frames for tents, lightweight but durable cooking vessels, and modular horse harness systems that could be quickly assembled or disassembled. These technological innovations allowed Sarmatian communities to maintain complex material cultures while achieving unprecedented levels of mobility. Environmental factors played a crucial role in shaping Sarmatian migration patterns and cultural development during this formative period. Paleoclimatic data indicates that the Pontic-Caspian steppes experienced significant climate fluctuations during the 7th and 6th centuries BC, including periods of increased aridity that reduced the carrying capacity of traditional grazing lands. These environmental pressures encouraged the development of more extensive migration patterns and may have contributed to the political fragmentation that characterized early Sarmatian society. The climate changes of this period also influenced the development of Sarmatian horse culture, which became one of their most distinctive cultural features. Increased aridity favoured the development of hardy horse breeds adapted to steppe conditions, while the need for greater mobility in response to environmental challenges encouraged innovations in riding techniques and horse management. Archaeological evidence from horse burials shows the development of improved bit designs and saddle technologies that enhance the effectiveness of mounted warfare and herding activities. The distinctive Sarmatian approach to horse breeding emphasized the production of large, powerful animals suitable for both warfare and long-distance travel. Osteological analysis of horse remains from Sarmatian sites reveals animals averaging 140 to 145 centimeters in height, significantly larger than typical steppe horses of earlier periods. These horses were bred for strength and endurance rather than speed, reflecting the Sarmatians' emphasis on heavily armed cavalry tactics that would later become their military signature. The integration of horse culture into Sarmatian social and religious life extended far beyond practical considerations of mobility and warfare. Horses occupied central positions in Sarmatian burial practices, with wealthy individuals interred alongside multiple horses equipped with elaborate harness fittings and decorative elements. The symbolic importance of horses in Sarmatian culture is evident in their artistic traditions, which frequently depicted horses in various media, including metalwork, textiles, and carved bone objects. The environmental adaptations that characterized early Sarmatian culture also included sophisticated strategies for managing livestock diversity. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sarmatian communities maintained mixed herds of horses, cattle, sheep, and goats in proportions that varied according to local environmental conditions and seasonal requirements. This diversified approach to pastoralism provided resilience against environmental fluctuations while supporting the complex social hierarchies that emerged within Sarmatian tribal confederations. The relationship between environmental factors and cultural development among the Sarmatians extended to their material culture and technological innovations. The harsh steppe environment encouraged the development of durable, multi-purpose tools and weapons that could withstand the rigours of nomadic life. Sarmatian metalworkers developed distinctive techniques for producing iron weapons with enhanced durability, including sophisticated heat treatment processes that created blades capable of maintaining sharp edges under demanding conditions. The early Sarmatian period also witnessed the development of distinctive artistic traditions that reflected both their nomadic lifestyle and their cultural connections to broader Eurasian artistic networks. The animal-style art that characterized Sarmatian decorative traditions showed clear influences from Scythian predecessors, but developed unique features that reflected Sarmatian cultural values and environmental adaptations. Sarmatian artists showed particular skill in creating portable art objects that could be easily transported during migrations while maintaining high levels of craftsmanship and artistic sophistication. The transformation of the Pontic-Caspian steppes during the 4th and 3rd centuries BC witnessed one of the most dramatic demographic and political upheavals in ancient Eurasian history. The Sarmatian expansion westward represented not merely a migration but a systematic conquest that fundamentally altered the balance of power across the Black Sea region. This westward movement began as early as 350 BC, when Sarmatian warbands first crossed the Don River in significant numbers, initiating a process that would ultimately displace the Scythian kingdoms that had dominated the region for over 3 centuries. The catalyst for this massive demographic shift stemmed from multiple converging pressures within the traditional Sarmatian heartlands. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Volga River indicates increasing population density during the 4th century BC, as evidenced by the proliferation of burial mounds and settlement sites. The Blumenfeld necropolis, for instance, shows a marked increase in burial activity between 300 and 300 BC, suggesting demographic pressures that exceeded the carrying capacity of traditional grazing territories. Simultaneously, climatic data derived from pollen analysis and lake sediment cores indicates a period of increased aridity beginning around 340 BC, which reduced the productivity of grasslands and forced pastoral communities to seek new territories. The political fragmentation occurring within the Scythian realm provided the Sarmatians with unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion. The death of the Scythian king Ateas in 339 BC during his campaign against Philip II of Macedon had left the Scythian confederations without centralized leadership. Greek sources, particularly Diodorus Siculus, describe how the various Scythian tribes began competing among themselves for supremacy, creating power vacuums that Sarmatian war leaders were quick to exploit. The Sarmatians did not simply occupy abandoned territories, but systematically displaced Scythian populations through a combination of military pressure and economic competition. The mechanics of Sarmatian territorial acquisition involved sophisticated strategies that went beyond simple military conquest. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Tanis and Elizavetovskaya reveals a pattern of gradual infiltration followed by demographic dominance. Sarmatian groups would initially establish seasonal camps in contested border regions, gradually increasing their presence until they achieved numerical superiority over local Scythian populations. This process often took decades to complete, with individual river valleys and grazing areas changing hands through a combination of intermarriage, alliance formation, and selective violence. The absorption of Scythian territories proceeded along predictable geographic corridors that reflected both environmental constraints and strategic considerations. The primary axis of expansion followed the Don River Valley westward toward the Dnieper, taking advantage of established trade routes and river crossings that had been developed during centuries of Scythian occupation. Secondary expansion occurred along the coastal plains of the Sea of Azov, where rich grasslands and access to Greek trading colonies provided both economic opportunities and strategic advantages. The military innovations that enabled Sarmatian success against their Scythian adversaries represented a fundamental transformation in steppe warfare tactics. While Scythian military doctrine had emphasized mobility and archery, relying on light cavalry equipped with composite bows to harass enemies and avoid direct confrontation, the Sarmatians developed heavy cavalry formations that could deliver decisive shock attacks against enemy formations. This tactical evolution reflected both technological advances in metallurgy and armour production, as well as changes in horse breeding that produced larger, stronger mounts capable of carrying heavily armoured warriors. The development of cataphract warfare among the Sarmatians occurred gradually during the 4th century BC, with archaeological evidence suggesting that the earliest experiments with heavy cavalry equipment began around 350 BC. Excavations at the Kosika cemetery have yielded iron-scale armour fragments and horse chamfrons that demonstrate the sophisticated metallurgical techniques required to produce effective protection for both rider and mount. The scale armour consisted of small iron plates, typically measuring 3 centimetres in length, that were sewn onto leather backing in overlapping patterns that provided flexibility while maintaining protective coverage. The famous Sarmatian lance, known to classical authors as the contus, represented perhaps the most significant innovation in steppe warfare technology. These weapons, measuring between 3.5 and 4.5 metres in length, were constructed from ash wood with iron points and counterweights that allowed mounted warriors to deliver devastating charges against enemy formations. The contus required specialised training techniques and horse breeds capable of maintaining stability during high-speed attacks, leading to the development of distinctive Sarmatian cavalry tactics that emphasised coordinated charge formations rather than individual combat prowess. Archaeological evidence for the contus comes primarily from burial contexts, where these weapons were often broken and placed alongside deceased warriors. The Novocherkassk treasure, discovered in 1864, contains several contus points, along with other military equipment that demonstrates the high status accorded to heavy cavalry warriors within Sarmatian society. The metallurgical analysis of these weapons reveals sophisticated forging techniques that produced points capable of penetrating both scale armour and shield systems used by contemporary armies. The tactical employment of cataphract formations required extensive coordination between individual warriors and their mounts, leading to the development of specialised training regimens that began in childhood. Young Sarmatian nobles learned to ride and fight as part of integrated cavalry units, practicing complex manoeuvres that allowed formations of 50, 100 cataphracts to operate as coordinated tactical entities. These formations could deliver concentrated shock attacks that proved devastatingly effective against the lighter Scythian cavalry formations that had previously dominated steppe warfare. The transformation of Sarmatian military capabilities also included innovations in siege warfare and the capture of fortified positions. Unlike their nomadic predecessors, who typically avoided prolonged sieges, Sarmatian warbands developed techniques for capturing Greek colonial cities and Scythian fortified settlements. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Neapolis Sithica shows evidence of systematic siege techniques, including the construction of earthwork ramps and the use of captured siege equipment to breach defensive walls. The establishment of major Sarmatian tribal confederations during this period reflected both the success of westward expansion and the need for political organisation capable of governing newly acquired territories. The Roxolani emerged as the most powerful confederation, controlling territories between the Dnieper and Dniester rivers that included some of the richest agricultural lands in the Pontic region. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Roxolani Confederation developed sophisticated administrative systems for managing both nomadic populations and sedentary agricultural communities that had been incorporated into their territories. The Aziges established themselves in the region between the Dniester and Danube rivers, positioning themselves to control trade routes between the Greek cities of the western Black Sea coast and the barbarian territories of Central Europe. The strategic location of Iazyges territories allowed them to extract tribute from merchant caravans while maintaining access to manufactured goods from Greek workshops. Excavations at sites associated with the Iazyges reveal extensive trade networks that brought Mediterranean luxury goods deep into the steppe regions. The Surayes maintained control over the Kuban River region and the eastern shores of the Sea of Azov, territories that provided access to the Caucasus trade routes and the rich agricultural lands of the Taman Peninsula. The Saracens developed particularly close relationships with the Greek cities of the Bosporan kingdom, serving as military allies and trading partners while maintaining their nomadic lifestyle and political independence. The material culture from Saracens sites shows extensive Greek influence, particularly in metalworking techniques and artistic styles. The Aorsi Confederation controlled the vast territories between the Don and Volga rivers, maintaining the traditional Sarmatian heartlands while extending their influence westward into newly conquered regions. The Aorsi appear to have maintained the most conservative approach to territorial organisation, preserving traditional nomadic practices while adapting to the challenges of governing expanded territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Aorsi developed sophisticated systems for managing seasonal migrations across territories that stretched over 1,000 kilometres from east to west. The impact of Sarmatian expansion on existing populations varied significantly depending on local circumstances and the strategies employed by individual Sarmatian confederations. In some regions, particularly along major river valleys, Scythian populations were completely displaced or absorbed through intermarriage and cultural assimilation. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Kamenskoye Gorodishche shows clear discontinuities in material culture that indicate population replacement rather than gradual cultural change. In other areas, particularly in marginal territories or regions with established Greek colonial presence, Sarmatian expansion resulted in more complex patterns of coexistence and cultural synthesis. The Greek cities of the northern Black Sea coast initially maintained their independence by playing different Sarmatian confederations against each other, providing military subsidies and trade concessions to prevent any single group from achieving regional dominance. This strategy proved successful for several generations, allowing cities such as Chersonesos and Tenias to maintain their prosperity while adapting to changing political circumstances. The transformation of the Pontic steppe political landscape involved not only the displacement of Scythian populations, but also the integration of diverse ethnic groups into expanding Sarmatian confederations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Thracian, Maeotian, and various Caucasian populations were incorporated into Sarmatian political structures, contributing specialized skills and local knowledge that enhanced the effectiveness of Sarmatian territorial control. This process of ethnic integration created complex hierarchical societies that combined nomadic pastoral traditions with elements of sedentary agricultural and urban life. The economic foundations of Sarmatian territorial expansion rested on their ability to control and tax trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the resources of the Eurasian steppes and forest zones. The Sarmatians inherited and expanded upon Scythian trade networks, but developed new commercial relationships that reflected their military capabilities and territorial control. The export of grain from newly conquered agricultural territories provided Sarmatian confederations with resources that could be exchanged for manufactured goods and luxury items from Greek workshops. The integration of agricultural populations into Sarmatian political structures represented a significant departure from traditional nomadic practices. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Dnieper Valley shows the development of hybrid settlement patterns that combined seasonal nomadic camps with permanent agricultural villages. These settlements were typically located near river valleys that provided both good grazing and arable land, allowing Sarmatian communities to diversify their economic base while maintaining their pastoral traditions. The consolidation of Sarmatian territories across the Pontic steppes during the 3rd century BC created the conditions for the emergence of one of antiquity's most complex nomadic societies. Archaeological evidence from major cemetery complexes such as Prokhorovka, Susli, and Kalinovka reveals a sophisticated social hierarchy that differed markedly from both their Scythian predecessors and contemporary nomadic confederations elsewhere in Eurasia. The Sarmatian social structure was fundamentally built around a warrior aristocracy, but one that incorporated unique elements of gender equality and military participation that distinguished it from other Indo-European societies of the period. The apex of Sarmatian society consisted of a hereditary warrior nobility, whose status was maintained through a combination of martial prowess, livestock wealth, and control over trade networks. Excavations at the Novocherkassk cemetery complex have revealed elite burials containing individuals interred with complete sets of cataphract armour, multiple horses with elaborate harness fittings, and grave goods that include imported Greek vessels, Chinese silk fragments, and Indian precious stones. These elite warriors were buried in large kurgans measuring up to 15 metres in height and 80 metres in diameter, requiring the coordinated labour of hundreds of individuals and representing massive investments of community resources. The warrior aristocracy was organised around extended kinship groups that controlled specific territories and maintained hereditary rights to seasonal grazing grounds, river crossings, and trade route access points. Each aristocratic lineage maintained its own tamga or property mark, which was carved or branded onto livestock, weapons, and personal possessions to indicate ownership and clan affiliation. Archaeological analysis of tamga symbols from Sarmatian sites reveals complex systems of inheritance and alliance formation, with related clans using variations of common symbols that indicated both kinship relationships and political subordination. The most distinctive aspect of Sarmatian social organisation was the prominent role accorded to aristocratic women, who enjoyed legal and social status that was unprecedented among contemporary Indo-European societies. Female members of the warrior aristocracy could own property independently, lead military expeditions, and exercise political authority over subordinate clan groups. Archaeological evidence for high-status women comes from richly furnished female burials that contain weapons, armour, and symbols of authority typically associated with male warriors in other cultures. The famous burial of the Amazon warrior from Pokrovka demonstrates the military role of aristocratic Sarmatian women. This 2nd century BC grave contained a female aged approximately 25, 30 years, who was buried with a complete set of scale armour, an iron sword, a bow with bronze-tipped arrows, and a ceremonial bronze mirror decorated with scenes of mounted combat. Osteological analysis revealed healed fractures on the left forearm and shoulder consistent with combat injuries, while isotope analysis of tooth enamel indicated a childhood spent in the eastern Sarmatian territories, followed by adult residents in the western regions, suggesting participation in long-distance military campaigns. Female warriors were not exceptional cases, but represented a systematic integration of women into Sarmatian military culture. Excavations at the Filipovka cemetery have revealed that approximately 20% of weapon-bearing burials contained female remains, with ages ranging from adolescence to middle age. These female warriors were equipped with the same weapon types as their male counterparts, including the distinctive Sarmatian longsword, composite bows and iron-tipped lances. The presence of horse burials alongside armed women indicates that they participated in mounted warfare as full members of cavalry formations rather than serving auxiliary roles. The archaeological evidence for female warriors corresponds with classical literary sources that describe Sarmatian women's participation in warfare. Pseudo-Silax noted that Sarmatian women ride horses and use bows and javelins from horseback and fight their enemies as long as they are virgins. Hippocrates provided more detailed observations, stating that Sarmatian women ride, shoot with the bow, and hurl javelins from horseback, and they fight their enemies as long as they remain unmarried. These accounts, while filtered through Greek cultural perspectives, corroborate the archaeological evidence for systematic female military participation. The integration of women into military activities reflected broader patterns of gender complementarity within Sarmatian society that extended beyond warfare into economic and religious spheres. Women controlled specific aspects of pastoral production, particularly the processing of dairy products and the weaving of textiles that were essential for both domestic use and trade. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals specialized tools associated with female activities, including elaborate spindle whorls, bone needles for leatherworking, and bronze cauldrons designed for processing mare's milk into fermented beverages. The religious authority of Sarmatian women is evidenced by their prominent role in burial rituals and their association with specific cult objects. Female graves often contain bronze mirrors with complex iconographic programs that appear to represent cosmological beliefs and mythological narratives. The mirror from the Prokhorovka cemetery depicts a central female figure surrounded by animals and geometric patterns that may represent seasonal cycles or astronomical phenomena. Similar mirrors have been found across Sarmatian territories, suggesting the existence of shared religious practices centered on female religious specialists. Beneath the warrior aristocracy, Sarmatian society included several distinct social strata that reflected both economic specialization and ethnic diversity within the confederations. Free herders constituted the majority of the population and were organized into extended family groups that maintained their own livestock herds while acknowledging the political authority of aristocratic clans. These families typically owned between 50 and 200 animals, primarily sheep and goats, with smaller numbers of horses and cattle, providing sufficient resources for economic independence while contributing tribute and military service to their aristocratic patrons. Archaeological evidence for free herder families comes from smaller burial mounds that contain modest grave goods but demonstrate participation in broader Sarmatian cultural traditions. These burials typically include locally produced pottery, iron tools, bronze ornaments, and occasionally single horses or partial horse burials. The consistency of burial practices across different social levels indicates the existence of shared cultural values and religious beliefs that transcended economic distinctions. Specialized craftsmen occupied a distinct position within Sarmatian society, producing the sophisticated metalwork, textiles, and decorative objects that characterized elite material culture. Archaeological evidence suggests that skilled craftsmen were often attached to aristocratic households, where they produced weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects for their patrons, while maintaining some degree of personal freedom and economic independence. The workshop areas identified at sites such as Tanais reveal specialized facilities for metalworking, including furnaces capable of achieving the high temperatures required for steel production and sophisticated tools for creating the intricate decorative elements that adorned Sarmatian weapons and ornaments. The lower stratum of Sarmatian society consisted of various dependent populations that included war captives, debt slaves, and members of conquered ethnic groups who had been incorporated into Sarmatian political structures. These individuals typically worked as herders for aristocratic families, tending large flocks of sheep and goats in remote grazing areas. Archaeological evidence for dependent populations is limited, as they were typically buried in simple graves with minimal grave goods, but their existence is indicated by references in classical sources and by the scale of livestock management evident at major Sarmatian sites. Sarmatian religious beliefs represented a complex synthesis of inherited Indo-Iranian traditions, with elements borrowed from Greek, Thracian, and Caucasian cultures encountered during their westward expansion. The core of Sarmatian religious practice centered on the worship of fire as a sacred element that connected the earthly and divine realms. Archaeological evidence for fire worship includes specialized bronze and iron fire altars found in elite burials and settlement contexts, as well as the widespread practice of cremation for certain categories of deceased individuals. Fire altars from Sarmatian sites typically consist of portable bronze vessels with perforated bases that allowed air circulation to maintain sacred flames. The most elaborate examples, such as those found in the Novocherkassk treasure, feature complex decorative programs that include animal motifs, geometric patterns, and human figures that may represent deities or mythological scenes. The portability of these altars reflects the nomadic lifestyle of Sarmatian communities, allowing them to maintain continuous religious observances during seasonal migrations. The worship of swords as sacred objects represented another distinctive aspect of Sarmatian religious practice that reflected their identity as a warrior society. Classical sources describe Sarmatian sword cults in which iron weapons were erected as standing stones and worshipped as manifestations of a war deity. Archaeological evidence for sword worship includes the discovery of iron swords deliberately planted point first in the ground at cemetery sites, often surrounded by offerings of animal bones and pottery vessels. The symbolic importance of swords in Sarmatian culture extended beyond religious practices into social and political spheres. The distinctive Sarmatian longsword, measuring between 90–110 centimetres in length, served as both a practical weapon and a symbol of aristocratic status. These swords were often decorated with gold and silver inlays that depicted animal motifs, geometric patterns, and occasionally human figures. The metallurgical analysis of Sarmatian swords reveals sophisticated forging techniques that produced flexible blades capable of withstanding the stresses of mounted combat while maintaining sharp cutting edges. Ancestor veneration constituted a fundamental aspect of Sarmatian religious practice that linked individual families to broader clan structures and territorial claims. The construction of elaborate burial mounds served not only as tombs for deceased family members, but as permanent markers of clan territory and focal points for ongoing religious observances. Archaeological evidence indicates that Sarmatian communities regularly returned to ancestral burial sites to conduct rituals, make offerings, and reaffirm kinship bonds that extended across generations. The Kurgan burial tradition reached its most sophisticated expression during the height of Sarmatian power in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The largest Sarmatian kurgans, such as the Kokhlach barrow near Novocherkassk, require the movement of over 7,000 cubic metres of earth and the construction of complex wooden burial chambers that were designed to preserve the deceased and their grave goods for eternity. These monumental constructions served as visible symbols of aristocratic power while creating sacred landscapes that reinforced clan identity and territorial claims. The syncretistic nature of Sarmatian religious beliefs is evident in their adoption and adaptation of Greek deities and mythological concepts encountered through contact with Black Sea colonies. Archaeological evidence from sites near Greek cities reveals Sarmatian interpretations of Greek religious iconography, with local craftsmen creating objects that combine traditional Sarmatian animal motifs with Greek mythological figures. The bronze plaque from the Gemanova Mogila Kurgan depicts a female figure that combines attributes of the Greek goddess Demeter with traditional Sarmatian fertility symbols, suggesting the development of hybrid religious concepts that bridged cultural boundaries. Roman influence on Sarmatian religious practices became increasingly evident during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, as diplomatic contacts and military alliances brought Sarmatian elites into direct contact with Roman officials and religious practices. Archaeological evidence includes the adoption of Roman military insignia and religious symbols, particularly among Sarmatian auxiliary units serving in the Roman army. The religious syncretism evident in these contexts suggests that Sarmatian communities were selective in their adoption of foreign religious elements, incorporating new deities and practices that complemented existing beliefs while maintaining core elements of traditional religious identity. The material culture of Sarmatian society reflected both their nomadic lifestyle and their position at the centre of extensive trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world with Central Asian and Chinese markets. Sarmatian pottery traditions developed distinctive characteristics that distinguished them from both Scythian predecessors and contemporary cultures, featuring hand-built vessels with carefully controlled firing techniques that produced hard, durable ceramics suitable for nomadic life. The most common Sarmatian pottery forms included large storage jars for fermented mare's milk, cooking pots with rounded bottoms that could be easily nested for transport, and drinking cups with distinctive rim profiles that may have served ceremonial as well as practical functions. The surface treatments of Sarmatian pottery often included geometric patterns created through cord marking, stamping, or incision, with some vessels featuring more elaborate decorative programs that incorporated animal motifs or abstract designs. Sarmatian metalworking traditions achieved remarkable sophistication in both practical and decorative applications. The production of iron weapons required advanced smelting techniques and specialized knowledge of heat treatment processes that could create steel blades with optimal combinations of hardness and flexibility. Archaeological analysis of Sarmatian weapons reveals the use of pattern welding techniques that created distinctive surface patterns while enhancing blade performance, as well as sophisticated methods for creating composite armor systems that combined iron scales with organic backing materials. The jewelry traditions of Sarmatian craftsmen developed the distinctive polychrome style that would later influence barbarian artistic traditions across Europe. This style featured the extensive use of garnet inlays, coloured glass, and gold filigree work to create complex decorative effects that emphasized colour contrast and surface texture. The technical skills required to create polychrome jewellery included the ability to cut and shape semi-precious stones, to create precise settings that held inlays securely, and to work gold into intricate patterns that complemented the coloured elements. The famous Novocherkassk diadem exemplifies the sophistication of Sarmatian polychrome work, featuring a gold framework set with garnets, coloured glass, and pearls arranged in complex geometric and animal motifs. The technical analysis of this piece reveals the use of advanced gold working techniques, including granulation, filigree, and repousse work, as well as sophisticated lapidary skills in the cutting and setting of the stone elements. The iconographic program of the diadem combines traditional Sarmatian animal motifs with elements that may derive from Persian or Central Asian artistic traditions, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of elite Sarmatian material culture. The expansion of Sarmatian power across the Pontic steppes inevitably brought these nomadic confederations into direct contact with the Greek colonial cities that had flourished along the Black Sea coast for over 4 centuries. The initial encounters between Sarmatians and Greeks occurred in the late 3rd century BC, when Sarmatian war bands first appeared in the territories surrounding the major trading centre of Tanais, at the mouth of the Don River. Archaeological evidence from the site reveals a gradual transformation in the material culture during this period, with traditional Greek pottery and architectural elements increasingly supplemented by Sarmatian-produced goods and burial practices that reflected the growing influence of the steppe peoples. Tanais, established around 275 BC as a colony of the Bosporan kingdom, occupied a strategically crucial position at the intersection of river and maritime trade routes. The city served as the primary conduit for Greek manufactured goods flowing into the steppe regions, while facilitating the export of grain, livestock products, and luxury items from Sarmatian territories to Mediterranean markets. The earliest evidence of Sarmatian presence at Tanais comes from burial contexts, dating to approximately 250 BC, where individuals with distinctly Sarmatian grave goods were interred using Greek burial practices, suggesting the beginning of cultural accommodation between the two populations. The relationship between Tanais and the surrounding Sarmatian communities developed along pragmatic lines that benefited both parties. Greek merchants gained access to vast quantities of agricultural products from the fertile river valleys, now controlled by Sarmatian confederations, while Sarmatian elites acquired manufactured goods, luxury items, and technical expertise that enhanced their status and military capabilities. Excavations in the residential quarters of Tanais have revealed workshops where Greek craftsmen produced weapons and decorative objects specifically designed to meet Sarmatian preferences, including the distinctive polychrome jewellery that became characteristic of steppe elite culture. The gradual integration of Sarmatian elements into Tanais society proceeded through several mechanisms that avoided direct confrontation while allowing for mutual accommodation. Intermarriage between Greek colonists and Sarmatian aristocrats created kinship networks that facilitated trade relationships and provided security guarantees for commercial activities. Archaeological evidence from family burial plots shows the development of hybrid burial practices that combined Greek architectural elements with Sarmatian grave goods and ritual practices, indicating the emergence of a genuinely mixed cultural community. The economic relationship between Tanais and the Sarmatians evolved beyond simple trade exchange, to include more sophisticated arrangements that reflected the military realities of the region. Sarmatian confederations provided military protection for Greek trading expeditions venturing into the interior, while Greek technical expertise enhanced Sarmatian agricultural productivity and craft production. The harbour facilities at Tanais were expanded during the 2nd century BC to accommodate larger vessels and increase trade volumes, with construction techniques that combined Greek engineering knowledge with local materials and labour provided by Sarmatian communities. Chersonesos, located on the southwestern coast of the Crimean Peninsula, developed a different pattern of interaction with Sarmatian confederations that reflected its greater distance from the main centres of nomadic power. The city maintained its independence through a combination of defensive fortifications, diplomatic alliances with multiple Sarmatian groups, and the provision of manufactured goods that were essential for maintaining steppe political hierarchies. Archaeological evidence from Chersonesos reveals extensive production facilities for bronze and iron objects designed specifically for export to Sarmatian markets, including weapons, horse harness fittings, and decorative elements for elite clothing and equipment. The defensive preparations undertaken by Chersonesos during the 2nd century BC demonstrate the city's awareness of the military threat posed by Sarmatian expansion. The construction of additional wall circuits and the strengthening of existing fortifications required massive investments of resources and labour, indicating that the Greek population viewed Sarmatian military capabilities with considerable respect. The defensive walls incorporated innovative design elements that combined traditional Greek masonry techniques with adaptations specifically designed to counter steppe siege tactics, including provisions for cavalry sorties and the storage of supplies sufficient for extended sieges. The diplomatic strategies employed by Chersonesos involved playing different Sarmatian confederations against each other while maintaining trade relationships with all major groups. Inscriptional evidence from the city reveals the existence of formal treaties with individual Sarmatian leaders that guaranteed safe passage for merchants in exchange for tribute payments and the provision of specific manufactured goods. These agreements were typically renewed on an annual basis, reflecting the fluid nature of steppe political arrangements and the need for constant diplomatic attention to maintain peaceful relationships. The Bosporan kingdom represented the most complex and significant arena of Sarmatian-Greek interaction, as the kingdom's territories included both Greek colonial cities and extensive agricultural regions that were increasingly dominated by Sarmatian populations. The Bosporan rulers faced the challenge of maintaining political control over diverse populations, while adapting to the changing military and economic realities created by Sarmatian expansion. Archaeological evidence from the Bosporan capital of Pontic-Caspian reveals significant changes in urban planning and defensive arrangements during the 2nd century BC, as the city was fortified against potential Sarmatian attacks while simultaneously accommodating increasing numbers of steppe peoples within its population. The integration of Sarmatians into Bosporan military structures began as early as 200 BC, when Sarmatian cavalry units were first employed as auxiliary forces to supplement the kingdom's traditional Greek hoplite formations. These early arrangements involved the hiring of Sarmatian warbands for specific campaigns, with payment provided in the form of manufactured goods, precious metals, and access to urban markets. The effectiveness of Sarmatian heavy cavalry in regional conflicts led to increasingly permanent arrangements, with entire Sarmatian clans receiving grants of land within Bosporan territory in exchange for military service obligations. The transformation of Sarmatian auxiliary forces into foederati represented a fundamental shift in the political structure of the Bosporan kingdom. Unlike simple mercenary arrangements, foederati agreement created permanent alliances between Sarmatian confederations and the Bosporan state that involved mutual defence obligations and shared political authority over specific territories. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Myrmekion and Nymphaeum shows the establishment of mixed communities where Sarmatian and Greek populations lived in close proximity while maintaining distinct cultural practices and social organisation. The military effectiveness of Sarmatian foederati transformed Bosporan strategic capabilities and allowed the kingdom to expand its territorial control during the 2nd century BC. Sarmatian heavy cavalry provided the kingdom with offensive capabilities that had been lacking in traditional Greek military formations, while Sarmatian knowledge of steppe warfare tactics enhanced the effectiveness of defensive operations against other nomadic groups. The combined Greek-Sarmatian forces proved particularly effective in conflicts with Scythian remnant populations and in campaigns against the emerging Pontic kingdom under Mithridates VI. The political influence of Sarmatian leaders within the Bosporan kingdom increased gradually as their military importance grew, and their economic contributions became essential for the kingdom's prosperity. By 150 BC, Sarmatian nobles were serving as advisors to Bosporan kings and participating in the administrative governance of territories with significant steppe populations. Inscriptional evidence reveals the existence of Sarmatian officials with Greek titles, indicating the development of hybrid administrative systems that combined elements of both political traditions. The cultural exchange between Sarmatians and Greeks extended far beyond military and political arrangements to encompass artistic traditions, religious practices, and technological innovations. Sarmatian elites became enthusiastic consumers of Greek luxury goods, particularly decorated pottery, jewellery, and textiles that served as symbols of status and sophistication within steppe society. Archaeological evidence from elite Sarmatian burials shows extensive collections of Greek imports, including Attic red figure pottery, bronze vessels with elaborate relief decoration, and gold jewellery produced in Greek workshops specifically for barbarian clientele. The adoption of Greek artistic motifs by Sarmatian craftsmen created distinctive hybrid styles that combine traditional steppe animal art with classical Greek figural representations. Bronze plaques from the Gaimanova Mogila Kurgan demonstrate sophisticated metalworking techniques that incorporated Greek mythological figures into traditional Sarmatian decorative programs. The technical quality of these hybrid works indicates that Greek craftsmen were working directly with Sarmatian patrons, or that Sarmatian artisans had received training in Greek workshops, suggesting extensive cultural exchange at the level of specialized craft production. Greek coinage systems were gradually adopted by Sarmatian confederations as their involvement in Mediterranean trade networks increased. The earliest Sarmatian coins, dating to approximately 180 BC, were crude imitations of Bosporan issues that retained Greek iconographic elements while incorporating Sarmatian symbols and inscriptions in Greek letters. Archaeological evidence from major Sarmatian sites shows the widespread circulation of both Greek and Sarmatian coins, indicating the development of monetized exchange systems that supplemented traditional barter arrangements. The religious syncretism that developed through Greek-Sarmatian contact created new cult practices that combined elements of both traditions while maintaining distinct cultural identities. Greek deities were identified with traditional Sarmatian divine figures, creating hybrid religious concepts that appealed to mixed populations in border regions. The cult of Artemis Bendis, documented in inscriptions from Tanais, combined the Greek goddess of the hunt with Thracian and Sarmatian fertility deities, creating a religious focus that served the needs of diverse ethnic communities. The military campaigns launched by Sarmatian confederations against Greek territories represented the most dramatic aspect of their relationship, demonstrating both the military capabilities of steppe forces and the limitations of Greek defensive strategies. The first major Sarmatian raid against Greek settlements occurred in 179 BC, when Roxolani forces attacked agricultural territories belonging to Chersonesos, destroying several rural settlements and capturing significant numbers of livestock and captives. The raid demonstrated the vulnerability of Greek agricultural communities to steppe warfare tactics and forced a reassessment of defensive strategies throughout the region. The Sarmatian siege of Olbia in 168 BC represented the most significant military confrontation between Greek and Sarmatian forces during this period. The city's location on the Bug River made it vulnerable to attack from the landward side, while its importance as a trading centre made it an attractive target for Sarmatian war leaders seeking to control commercial networks. Archaeological evidence from Olbia shows extensive damage to residential quarters and public buildings that is consistent with siege warfare, including evidence of fire damage and the hasty burial of valuable objects by fleeing inhabitants. The siege techniques employed by Sarmatian forces against Olbia demonstrated their adaptation of traditional steppe warfare methods to the challenges of attacking fortified positions. Rather than attempting direct assaults against the city's walls, Sarmatian forces established a blockade that prevented the arrival of supplies and reinforcements, while conducting systematic raids against the surrounding agricultural territories. The siege was maintained for approximately 8 months before the city's defenders negotiated a surrender that included tribute payments and the provision of manufactured goods to the besieging forces. The impact of Sarmatian military pressure on Greek colonial cities extended beyond immediate damage to include fundamental changes in urban planning, defensive strategies, and economic relationships. Cities throughout the region invested heavily in fortification improvements, including the construction of additional wall circuits, the strengthening of gates and towers, and the creation of protected harbours that could accommodate defensive fleets. These defensive investments required massive expenditures that strained municipal finances while reducing resources available for commercial and cultural activities. The economic disruption caused by Sarmatian raids forced Greek cities to develop new strategies for maintaining commercial relationships while protecting their populations and resources. The establishment of fortified trading posts in neutral territories allowed merchants to conduct business with Sarmatian groups without exposing major urban centres to military risk. Archaeological evidence from sites such as the Elizavetovskaya settlement shows the development of specialised commercial facilities that combine defensive features with storage and workshop areas designed to serve both Greek and Sarmatian needs. The transformation of regional political structures during this period reflected the growing influence of Sarmatian military power and the adaptation of Greek institutional frameworks to accommodate steppe political realities. The traditional Greek polis system, based on citizen participation and urban-centred governance, proved inadequate for managing territories that included significant nomadic populations with different political traditions and economic practices. The development of hybrid governmental systems that combined Greek administrative expertise with Sarmatian military leadership created new forms of political organisation that would influence regional development for centuries. The long-term consequences of Greek-Sarmatian interaction extended far beyond the immediate military and political conflicts to include fundamental changes in cultural identity, economic organisation, and social structure throughout the Black Sea region. The integration of Sarmatian populations into Greek colonial societies created new ethnic identities that combined elements of both traditions, while maintaining distinct characteristics that reflected local conditions and historical experiences. Archaeological evidence from mixed communities shows the development of material culture traditions that cannot be classified as purely Greek or Sarmatian, but represent genuine cultural synthesis that emerged from sustained interaction between different populations. The collision between Roman imperial expansion and Sarmatian territorial ambitions along the Danube frontier marked a fundamental shift in the geopolitical landscape of southeastern Europe. The first documented contact between Roman forces and Sarmatian confederations occurred during Augustus's Pannonian campaigns of 9 BC, when Roman legionaries encountered Iazyger's cavalry units operating as allies of the Dacian king Burebista. These initial encounters revealed the formidable military capabilities of Sarmatian heavy cavalry, while demonstrating the strategic importance of the Danube River as both a natural boundary and a contested zone of influence between expanding imperial powers. The Roman military's first systematic assessment of Sarmatian warfare capabilities came through intelligence reports compiled during Tiberius's campaigns along the Middle Danube between 9 AD. Roman observers noted the distinctive tactical formations employed by Sarmatian cataphracts, describing their coordinated charge attacks as capable of breaking through traditional legionary formations when deployed on favourable terrain. The reports emphasised the superior quality of Sarmatian horses, bred specifically for carrying heavily armoured warriors, and the sophisticated metallurgical techniques that produced their distinctive scale armour and long lances. Archaeological evidence from Roman military sites along the Danube frontier reveals extensive preparations for defending against Sarmatian cavalry attacks. The fortress at Carnuntum, established around 15 AD, incorporated defensive features specifically designed to counter-mounted warfare, including wider ditches filled with sharpened stakes, reinforced gates capable of withstanding cavalry charges, and elevated platforms that provided Roman archers with clear fields of fire against approaching horsemen. The construction techniques employed at these frontier fortifications represented significant innovations in Roman military engineering, adapting traditional designs to address the unique challenges posed by steppe warfare tactics. The strategic importance of the Danube frontier became increasingly apparent as Roman administrators recognized the river's role as both a natural barrier and a crucial transportation route connecting the Black Sea with the Central European territories. The establishment of the Danubian fleet under Tiberius created new capabilities for projecting Roman power into Sarmatian territories while providing logistical support for land-based operations. Archaeological excavations at Roman naval bases such as Ratiaria have revealed specialized facilities for constructing and maintaining river warships, including dry docks, weapon storage areas, and barracks for naval personnel trained in riverine warfare. The first major military confrontation between Roman and Sarmatian forces occurred in 69 AD during the Civil War, following Nero's death, when 9,000 Roxolani cavalry crossed the frozen Danube to raid Moesian territories. The Roxolani force, led by a nobleman named Dorpaneus, consisted primarily of heavily armoured cataphracts equipped with the traditional contus lance and supported by lighter cavalry units armed with composite bows. The timing of the invasion took advantage of Roman political instability and the temporary withdrawal of regular legionary units from frontier positions to participate in the succession struggles. The Roxolani invasion force moved rapidly through the Wallacian plain, avoiding Roman fortified positions, while systematically plundering rural settlements and capturing livestock and captives. Roman sources describe the devastating effectiveness of Sarmatian cavalry charges against unprepared civilian populations, with entire villages abandoned as inhabitants fled toward fortified cities. The psychological impact of the raids extended far beyond the immediate damage, as reports of Sarmatian military prowess spread throughout the Danubian provinces and influenced Roman strategic planning for decades. The Roman response to the Roxolani invasion demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of traditional legionary tactics when confronting steppe warfare. The 3rd Gallica Legion, stationed at Oescus under the command of Marcus Aponius Saturninus, attempted to intercept the Sarmatian force using conventional pursuit tactics that proved inadequate against highly mobile cavalry formations. The initial Roman advance was conducted in standard marching formation, with heavy infantry in the centre flanked by auxiliary cavalry units that were significantly outnumbered and outclassed by their Sarmatian counterparts. The decisive engagement occurred near the modern city of Adamclisi, where the Roman force succeeded in forcing a battle by threatening the Sarmatian withdrawal route across the Danube. The tactical details preserved in Tacitus's account reveal the challenges faced by Roman commanders when confronting cataphract formations on open terrain favourable to cavalry operations. The Roxolani deployed in their traditional wedge formations, with the heaviest armoured warriors at the front supported by successive ranks of lighter cavalry that could exploit breakthroughs or provide covering fire during withdrawal. The Roman tactical response involved the use of concentrated javelin volleys from legionary ranks, aimed at disrupting Sarmatian charge formations before they could achieve decisive impact. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield site includes numerous iron pilum points and Sarmatian scale armour fragments that demonstrate the effectiveness of Roman missile weapons against even heavily protected cavalry. The legionaries' disciplined formations and superior numbers ultimately prevailed, but only after sustaining significant casualties that highlighted the vulnerability of traditional infantry tactics to mounted warfare. The aftermath of the 69 AD battle revealed important lessons about Sarmatian military capabilities and limitations that would influence subsequent Roman strategic planning. Captured Sarmatian equipment provided Roman military engineers with detailed knowledge of steppe armour and weapon technologies, leading to improvements in Roman cavalry equipment and the development of specialised anti-cavalry tactics. The interrogation of prisoners revealed information about Sarmatian political organisation, seasonal migration patterns, and the internal disputes that could be exploited to prevent future coordinated attacks. The period of relative peace following the Roxolani defeat allowed for diplomatic initiatives that established formal relationships between Roman provincial authorities and Sarmatian tribal leaders. The treaty negotiated in 70 AD between Governor Plautius Silvanus and the Roxolani king Pharasmanes created a framework for managing frontier relations that included provisions for trade, the return of captives, and the establishment of buffer zones where neither power would maintain permanent military installations. Archaeological evidence from trading posts established along the Danube during this period shows the rapid development of commercial relationships that benefited both Roman merchants and Sarmatian elites. The resumption of large-scale Sarmatian raids during Domitian's reign reflected both internal pressures within Sarmatian confederations and changing strategic circumstances along the Danube frontier. The Roxolani invasion of 85 AD involved significantly larger forces than previous raids, with Roman sources estimating the attacking army at over 15,000 cavalry, supported by allied infantry from Dacian and Germanic tribes. The scale of the invasion suggested coordination between multiple Sarmatian confederations and represented a serious challenge to Roman territorial control in the Danubian provinces. The 85 AD invasion followed a different strategic pattern from earlier raids, with Sarmatian forces attempting to establish permanent footholds in Roman territory rather than conducting hit-and-run attacks. Archaeological evidence from sites in Wallachia reveals the construction of temporary fortifications using traditional Sarmatian earth and timber techniques, indicating plans for extended occupation of conquered territories. The establishment of these camps required significant logistical preparation and suggested the involvement of non-combatant populations in supporting the military operations. The Roman response to the 85 AD invasion involved the deployment of multiple legions under the personal command of Domitian, representing the largest military commitment to Danubian operations since the initial conquest of the region. The 1st Minervia and 2nd Adiutrix legions were transferred from Rhine frontier positions, while the 5th Macedonica was redeployed from Egyptian garrisons to provide additional heavy infantry capabilities. The concentration of these forces required extensive logistical preparations, including the construction of new supply depots and the expansion of existing road networks to support rapid troop movements. The tactical innovations employed by Roman forces during the 85-86 AD campaigns reflected lessons learned from previous encounters with Sarmatian cavalry. The development of mixed formations that integrated legionary infantry with increased numbers of auxiliary cavalry created more flexible tactical options for confronting mobile enemies. Archaeological evidence from military equipment deposits shows the introduction of longer spears and improved shield designs specifically intended to counter cavalry charges, while changes in auxiliary cavalry equipment demonstrate the adoption of some Sarmatian techniques and weapons. The siege of the Sarmatian fortified camp at Steppe represented a significant departure from traditional steppe warfare patterns and demonstrated the adaptability of Sarmatian military leaders to changing tactical circumstances. The fortification combined traditional earthwork techniques with innovations borrowed from Roman military engineering, including the use of sharpened stakes, overlapping defensive ditches, and elevated platforms for mounted archers. The siege lasted for several weeks and required Roman forces to develop new techniques for attacking positions defended by cavalry-based armies. The outcome of the Steppe siege established important precedents for future Roman-Sarmatian conflicts, while revealing the limitations of both military systems when operating outside their optimal tactical environments. Roman siege techniques proved effective against Sarmatian fortifications, but the extended duration of the operation allowed other Sarmatian confederations to organize relief expeditions that complicated Roman strategic planning. The eventual Roman victory came at considerable cost and demonstrated that successful operations against Sarmatian forces required careful preparation and significant resource commitments. The involvement of Sarmatian confederations in the Dacian Wars of 101, 102 and 106 AD mark the culmination of their military confrontation with Roman expansion in southeastern Europe. The alliance between the Dacian king Decebalus and various Sarmatian leaders created a formidable coalition that combined Dacian knowledge of mountain warfare with Sarmatian cavalry expertise. Archaeological evidence from Dacian fortified sites reveals the presence of Sarmatian military equipment and burial practices, indicating the deployment of significant Sarmatian forces in support of Dacian resistance to Roman conquest. The strategic coordination between Dacian and Sarmatian forces represented a sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics that maximised the effectiveness of different military specialisations. Dacian infantry provided the defensive capabilities necessary for holding fortified positions, while Sarmatian cavalry conducted reconnaissance, harassment operations, and rapid response to Roman tactical movements. The integration of these different military traditions required extensive planning and communication systems that demonstrate the political and military sophistication of the anti-Roman coalition. The role of Sarmatian heavy cavalry in the major battles of the Dacian Wars provided Roman military observers with extensive opportunities to study steppe warfare tactics under various tactical conditions. The Battle of Adamclisi in 102 AD featured the largest deployment of Sarmatian cataphracts in a single engagement, with an estimated 5,000 heavily armoured cavalry participating in coordinated charge attacks against Roman formations. The tactical details preserved in Trajan's column and contemporary literary sources reveal the effectiveness of Sarmatian shock tactics when properly supported by infantry formations and employed on suitable terrain. The defeat of the Dacian-Sarmatian coalition required Roman forces to develop new tactical approaches that could effectively counter the combined threat posed by mountain infantry and steppe cavalry. The solution involved the use of segmented operations that isolated different enemy forces and prevented effective coordination between Dacian and Sarmatian units. Roman engineering capabilities proved crucial in this strategy, as the construction of fortified lines and supply roads allowed Roman forces to control key terrain features while maintaining logistical support for extended operations. The aftermath of the Dacian Wars fundamentally altered the strategic balance along the Danube frontier and created new opportunities for diplomatic solutions to Roman-Sarmatian conflicts. The elimination of Dacian political independence removed a crucial ally for Sarmatian military operations while establishing Roman territorial control over strategic river crossings and mountain passes. The incorporation of Dacian territories into the Roman provincial system created buffer zones that reduced direct contact between Roman settlements and Sarmatian tribal territories. Hadrian's approach to Sarmatian relations represented a fundamental shift from military confrontation to diplomatic accommodation that recognized the impracticality of conquering the vast steppe territories controlled by nomadic confederations. The diplomatic initiatives launched during Hadrian's visit to the Danube frontier in 124 AD established formal treaty relationships with major Sarmatian leaders that provided security guarantees in exchange for Roman recognition of Sarmatian territorial claims and the provision of annual subsidies in manufactured goods and precious metals. The client relationship established between Rome and the Roxolani Confederation under King Rasparagonus created a model for managing relations with other Sarmatian groups that balance Roman strategic interests with respect for nomadic political autonomy. The treaty provisions included mutual defence agreements that obligated Sarmatian forces to assist Roman operations against common enemies while guaranteeing Roman support for legitimate Sarmatian territorial claims. Archaeological evidence from trading posts established under these agreements shows the rapid expansion of commercial relationships that provided economic benefits for both parties. The transformation of former enemies into allied foederati represented one of the most successful aspects of Hadrianic frontier policy and demonstrated the effectiveness of diplomatic solutions when supported by adequate military deterrence. Sarmatian auxiliary units began serving in Roman armies as early as 125 AD, providing valuable cavalry capabilities for operations in other frontier regions, while creating personal relationships between Sarmatian nobles and Roman military commanders. the integration of Sarmatian military traditions into Roman tactical doctrine enhanced the effectiveness of Roman cavalry operations and provided models for managing relationships with other nomadic peoples along the imperial frontiers. The transformation of Sarmatian confederations from frontier adversaries to integral components of the Roman military system represented one of the most remarkable examples of barbarian integration in imperial history. The process began during Hadrian's systematic reorganization of Danubian frontier defences in the 120 SAD, when Roman military planners recognized that Sarmatian heavy cavalry could provide capabilities that complemented rather than threatened imperial strategic objectives. The first formal recruitment agreements were negotiated with Roxolani and Iazyges leaders in 124 AD, establishing precedents for incorporating entire tribal units into Roman auxiliary forces while maintaining their traditional command structures and tactical methods. The initial deployment of Sarmatian auxiliary units occurred along the Rhine frontier, where their mobility and shock capabilities proved invaluable for operations against Germanic tribes that had previously proven difficult for conventional Roman forces to engage effectively. Archaeological evidence from military sites at Mogontiacum and Bona reveals the construction of specialized facilities for housing Sarmatian cavalry units, including enlarged stables designed to accommodate the larger horses bred for cataphract warfare, and workshops for maintaining the complex armour systems that distinguish Sarmatian military equipment from standard Roman auxiliary gear. The adaptation of Sarmatian military units to Roman organisational structures required careful negotiation between imperial administrators and tribal leaders to preserve essential elements of steppe warrior culture while ensuring effective integration into Roman tactical doctrine. Sarmatian auxiliary units maintained their traditional decimal organisation based on units of 10, 50 and 100 warriors, but were grouped into larger formations that corresponded to Roman cohort structures. The command arrangements preserved the authority of hereditary war leaders while establishing clear chains of responsibility to Roman provincial governors and legionary commanders. The distinctive equipment and tactics of Sarmatian auxiliaries necessitated modifications to standard Roman logistical systems and training procedures. The Contus lance, measuring up to 4 meters in length, required specialized transport arrangements and storage facilities that differed significantly from equipment used by other auxiliary units. The scale armour worn by Sarmatian cataphracts demanded maintenance techniques that were unfamiliar to Roman military artificers, leading to the establishment of specialized workshops staffed by Sarmatian craftsmen who possessed the necessary technical knowledge. The deployment of Sarmatian auxiliary units across the Roman Empire created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and technological transfer between steppe peoples and Mediterranean civilizations. Units of Roxolani cavalry served in Britain from 130 AD onward, participating in campaigns against Caledonian tribes and contributing to the construction of Hadrian's Wall through their knowledge of earthwork fortification techniques adapted from steppe warfare traditions. Archaeological evidence from military sites at Hausteds and Burdeswald includes horse equipment and personal ornaments that demonstrate the maintenance of Sarmatian cultural identity within Roman military contexts. The presence of Sarmatian cavalry in Britain introduced new tactical capabilities that enhanced Roman operational effectiveness in the challenging terrain of northern England and southern Scotland. The mobility of mounted units proved particularly valuable for reconnaissance operations and rapid response to tribal raids, while the psychological impact of heavily armoured cavalry on Celtic warriors provided Roman commanders with additional tactical options for achieving decisive battlefield outcomes. The integration of Sarmatian units into British garrison forces required the development of new logistical systems for maintaining horses and equipment in the humid climate of northern Britain, leading to innovations in veterinary care and metalworking techniques that benefited the entire provincial military establishment. Sarmatian auxiliary units deployed to Syria and the eastern frontier brought their expertise in mounted archery and cavalry tactics to bear against Parthian forces that employed similar military methods derived from shared steppe traditions. The familiarity of Sarmatian warriors with the tactical approaches used by Parthian cataphracts provided Roman commanders with valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and weaknesses. Archaeological evidence from military sites at Stura Europos and Palmyra reveals the presence of Sarmatian equipment and burial practices, indicating the long-term deployment of these units in eastern frontier regions where their specialized skills were particularly valuable. The service records preserved in military diplomas and inscriptions demonstrate that Sarmatian auxiliary units maintained consistently high performance standards throughout their service in Roman armies. Veterans of Sarmatian units received Roman citizenship upon completion of their military obligations, creating a class of individuals who possessed both Roman legal status and intimate knowledge of steppe cultural traditions. These veterans often served as intermediaries between Roman administrators and tribal communities, facilitating diplomatic negotiations and commercial relationships that benefited both parties. The settlement programs initiated under Hadrian and expanded during the reigns of Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius represented systematic efforts to transform nomadic Sarmatian populations into sedentary agricultural communities within Roman territorial boundaries. The largest and most successful of these programs occurred in Pannonia, where the fertile plains between the Danube and Sava rivers provided ideal conditions for establishing mixed agricultural and pastoral communities. Archaeological surveys of rural settlements in the Srem region have identified over 200 sites with material culture that demonstrates the gradual transition from nomadic to sedentary lifestyles over the course of several generations. The planning and implementation of Sarmatian settlement programs required careful attention to the environmental and social factors that would determine their success or failure. Roman administrators recognized that abrupt transitions from nomadic to sedentary lifestyles would likely result in social disruption and economic hardship, leading to the development of gradual integration processes that allowed Sarmatian communities to maintain essential elements of their traditional economic activities while adopting agricultural practices. The settlement sites were typically located near river valleys that provided both good grazing for livestock and arable land suitable for grain production. The architectural evidence from Sarmatian settlement sites in Pannonia reveals the development of distinctive building traditions that combined Roman construction techniques with design elements derived from nomadic housing traditions. The typical Sarmatian farmstead consisted of a rectangular timber-framed house with a sunken floor and central hearth, surrounded by outbuildings for livestock and storage that reflected the continued importance of animal husbandry in the community's economic life. The construction techniques employed locally available materials while incorporating Roman innovations such as tile roofing and hypocaust heating systems that improved living conditions during harsh winter months. The agricultural practices adopted by settled Sarmatian communities represented a synthesis of Mediterranean farming techniques with steppe pastoral traditions that created productive and sustainable land use systems. Archaeological evidence from excavated settlements shows the cultivation of wheat, barley, and millet alongside the maintenance of substantial livestock herds that included horses, cattle, sheep, and goats. The integration of crop production with animal husbandry allowed these communities to achieve economic diversification that reduced their vulnerability to environmental fluctuations, while maintaining cultural connections to their nomadic heritage. The social organisation of settled Sarmatian communities preserved important elements of traditional kinship structures while adapting to the requirements of territorial residence and agricultural production. Extended family groups continued to function as primary economic units, but their activities were now focused on specific landholdings rather than seasonal migration routes. The leadership roles traditionally held by war chiefs evolved into positions that combined military responsibilities with agricultural management and representation in Roman administrative systems. The establishment of Sarmatian communities in Dacia followed different patterns that reflected the unique circumstances of that province's recent conquest and the presence of significant indigenous populations with their own agricultural traditions. The Sarmatian settlers in Dacia were primarily Roxolani groups that had been displaced by conflicts with other steppe confederations and sought Roman protection in exchange for military service and agricultural development of frontier regions. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Banat region shows the development of fortified agricultural settlements that combined defensive features with facilities for crop production and livestock management. The integration of Sarmatian settlers into existing Dacian communities created complex multicultural societies that preserved distinct ethnic identities while developing shared economic and social institutions. The material culture from mixed settlements shows the gradual adoption of Roman building techniques and pottery styles alongside the maintenance of traditional Sarmatian metalworking traditions and decorative arts. The linguistic evidence suggests that Sarmatian languages continued to be spoken within these communities, while Latin gradually became the primary language for official and commercial transactions. The process of cultural assimilation among settled Sarmatian populations proceeded at different rates and in different ways depending on local circumstances and the degree of contact with Roman urban centres. Communities located near major cities such as Sirmium and Aquincum experienced more rapid adoption of Roman cultural practices, including the use of Latin inscriptions, Roman naming conventions, and participation in urban commercial networks. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites shows the gradual transition from traditional Sarmatian burial practices to Roman-style inhumation, though many communities maintained hybrid practices that combined elements of both traditions. The adoption of Roman religious practices by Sarmatian communities occurred alongside rather than in replacement of traditional spiritual beliefs, creating syncretic religious systems that incorporated elements from multiple cultural traditions. Archaeological evidence from religious sites shows the construction of temples dedicated to Roman deities such as Jupiter and Mars, but with architectural features and ritual practices that reflected Sarmatian cultural preferences. The continued use of fire altars and the worship of swords as sacred objects demonstrates the persistence of core Sarmatian religious concepts within Romanized contexts. The gradual Christianization of Sarmatian communities began during the late 2nd century AD through contact with Christian missionaries and merchants travelling along Danubian trade routes. The earliest evidence for Christian practices among Sarmatians comes from burial contexts, where traditional grave goods are absent and bodies are oriented according to Christian burial practices. The spread of Christianity was facilitated by its compatibility with certain aspects of Sarmatian religious traditions, particularly the emphasis on spiritual warfare and the veneration of martyrs as warrior saints. The development of Christian communities among settled Sarmatians created new forms of cultural identity that transcended ethnic boundaries while preserving important elements of traditional social organisation. Christian Sarmatian communities maintained their distinctive languages and kinship structures while participating in broader networks of religious affiliation that connected them to Christian populations throughout the Roman Empire. Archaeological evidence from church sites in Pannonia and Dacia shows architectural features that reflect Sarmatian cultural preferences, including the use of traditional decorative motifs and the incorporation of spaces for community gatherings that served both religious and social functions. The material culture of Romano-Sarmatian communities demonstrates the selective adoption of Roman technologies and artistic styles, while maintaining distinctive characteristics that reflected their steppe heritage. Pottery production in these communities combined Roman wheel-throwing techniques with traditional Sarmatian decorative traditions, creating distinctive ceramic styles that can be identified at archaeological sites throughout the Danubian provinces. The metalworking traditions showed similar patterns of cultural synthesis, with Roman techniques for producing iron tools and weapons, combined with traditional Sarmatian expertise in creating decorative elements and specialized cavalry equipment. The preservation of traditional Sarmatian artistic motifs within Roman cultural contexts created distinctive regional styles that influenced the development of provincial Roman art throughout the Danubian frontier regions. Bronzework from Romano-Sarmatian workshops shows the continued use of animal-style decorative elements, particularly stylized representations of horses, eagles, and other creatures that held symbolic significance in traditional Sarmatian culture. These motifs were adapted to Roman artistic contexts through their incorporation into belt fittings, jewellery and decorative elements for military equipment that served both functional and symbolic purposes. The textile traditions of Romano-Sarmatian communities preserved sophisticated weaving techniques and decorative patterns that had been developed during centuries of nomadic life. Archaeological evidence from waterlogged sites has preserved fragments of woolen textiles with complex geometric patterns and colour schemes that demonstrate the continuation of traditional Sarmatian artistic traditions. The production of these textiles required specialised knowledge of dyeing techniques and pattern weaving that was passed down through female lineages and represented an important source of cultural continuity within assimilating communities. The horse-breeding traditions that had been central to Sarmatian culture continued to play important roles in Romano-Sarmatian communities, though adapted to the requirements of settled agricultural life. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites shows the construction of specialised facilities for horse breeding and training, including enclosed paddocks and covered stables that represented investments in maintaining high-quality breeding stock. The horses produced by these communities were highly valued by Roman military authorities and provided an important source of income that helped finance the transition to agricultural lifestyles. The archaeological record of Romano-Sarmatian burial practices reveals the gradual transformation of traditional mortuary rituals while preserving core elements that maintained connections to ancestral traditions. Early Romano-Sarmatian burials often included both traditional Sarmatian grave goods, such as weapons and horse equipment, alongside Roman items such as coins and pottery vessels. The evolution of burial practices over time shows the increasing influence of Roman customs, but with persistent elements such as the orientation of graves and the inclusion of specific categories of grave goods that reflected continuing adherence to traditional beliefs about death and the afterlife. The economic integration of Sarmatian communities into Roman commercial networks created new opportunities for prosperity while requiring adaptations to market-oriented production systems. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites shows the development of specialised craft production aimed at both local consumption and export to Roman urban markets. Sarmatian metalworkers found ready markets for their distinctive decorative objects and military equipment, while agricultural products from settled communities contributed to the food supply systems that supported Roman military garrisons and urban populations throughout the Danubian provinces. The emergence of the Alans as the dominant force within the Sarmatian confederations during the 3rd century AD marked a fundamental transformation in the political and cultural landscape of the Pontic steppes. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Don and Kuban rivers indicates that Alanic groups, originally concentrated in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, began expanding northward into traditional Sarmatian territories around 220 AD. The material culture from this period shows distinctive changes in burial practices, weapon types, and decorative arts that reflect the gradual absorption of existing Sarmatian populations into a new political framework dominated by Alanic leadership structures. The initial phase of Alanic expansion appears to have been facilitated by internal conflicts within established Sarmatian confederations, particularly disputes over succession rights and territorial boundaries that had weakened traditional political alliances. Excavations at the Kobyakovo settlement on the Lower Don reveal evidence of violent destruction around 230 AD, followed by the construction of new defensive works using techniques characteristic of Alanic military engineering. The burned layer contains fragments of Sarmatian weapons and pottery, alongside the remains of structures that were systematically dismantled, suggesting organised conquest rather than gradual cultural assimilation. The Alanic military organisation that emerged during this period represented a synthesis of traditional Sarmatian cavalry tactics with innovations derived from contact with Caucasian mountain peoples and Roman military practices. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits at Novocherkassk shows the development of improved lance designs that incorporated reinforced socket construction and counterweight systems that enhanced the effectiveness of cavalry charges. The metallurgical analysis of these weapons reveals sophisticated forging techniques that produced lighter yet stronger lance points, capable of penetrating the improved armour systems that were simultaneously being developed by Alanic craftsmen. The evolution of Alanic heavy cavalry tactics during the 3rd century involved significant modifications to traditional Sarmatian cataphract formations that reflected lessons learned from decades of contact with Roman military forces. The tactical innovations included the development of deeper formation structures that could maintain momentum through multiple charge phases, as well as improved coordination between heavy cavalry units and supporting light cavalry forces equipped with composite bows. Archaeological evidence from training grounds in Itanai reveals the construction of practice facilities where cavalry formations could rehearse complex manoeuvres, including parallel approaches, feigned retreats, and coordinated wheeling movements that maximise the impact of successive charge attacks. The technological advances achieved by Alanic metalworkers during this period established new standards for both defensive and offensive equipment that influenced military development throughout the region. The scale armour systems produced in Alanic workshops featured improved articulation between individual plates that provided greater flexibility without sacrificing protective coverage. The manufacturing process involved sophisticated heat treatment techniques that created armour scales with hardened surfaces and flexible cores, allowing warriors to maintain mobility while gaining protection against both missile weapons and direct combat strikes. Excavations at the Kobiakovo workshop complex have revealed specialised tools for scale production, including forming dyes, quenching baths and finishing equipment that demonstrate the industrial scale of Alanic armour production. The development of improved horse breeding programs under Alanic leadership produced cavalry mounts that were larger and more powerful than their Sarmatian predecessors. Osteological analysis of horse remains from Alanic burial sites indicates animals averaging 155 centimetres in height, representing a significant increase over earlier Sarmatian breeds. These horses were bred specifically for carrying heavily armoured warriors over long distances while maintaining the speed and agility necessary for effective cavalry operations. The breeding programs required extensive knowledge of equine genetics and careful selection of breeding stock that was maintained through detailed oral traditions passed down through specialised horsekeeping families. The Alanic approach to territorial organisation differed significantly from earlier Sarmatian practices through the establishment of more centralised political structures that could effectively coordinate military operations across vast geographical areas. Archaeological evidence from major Alanic centres such as the settlement at Kobiakovo reveals the construction of substantial administrative buildings with specialised storage facilities for weapons, armour and other military equipment. These centres served as regional headquarters where tribal leaders could coordinate seasonal campaigns, distribute military supplies and maintain communication networks that connected scattered nomadic groups across the steppes. The integration of remaining Sarmatian populations into the Alanic tribal union proceeded through a combination of military conquest, political alliance, and cultural assimilation that preserved important elements of traditional steppe society, while establishing new hierarchical relationships. Smaller Sarmatian groups that submitted voluntarily to Alanic authority were typically allowed to maintain their traditional leadership structures and territorial claims, but were required to provide a military service and tribute to Alanic overlords. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the region shows the gradual adoption of Alanic material culture traditions alongside the persistence of local customs and practices that maintained distinct regional identities within the broader confederation. The absorption of Sarmatian populations involved systematic efforts to integrate their specialized skills and knowledge into Alanic military and economic systems. Sarmatian craftsmen who possessed expertise in specific metalworking techniques or decorative arts were often relocated to major Alanic centres, where they could train local artisans and contribute to the development of new production capabilities. The workshop areas at Kobiakovo contain evidence of multi-ethnic craft production, with tools and techniques characteristic of different Sarmatian regional traditions, combined in single production facilities that created hybrid technological systems. The cultural continuity that characterized the Alanic transformation reflected deliberate policies aimed at preserving valuable elements of Sarmatian tradition while establishing new political and military frameworks. Traditional Sarmatian religious practices, including fire worship and sword veneration, were maintained within Alanic communities, but were integrated into new ceremonial contexts that emphasized the authority of Alanic leadership. Archaeological evidence from religious sites shows the construction of larger fire altars and ceremonial spaces that could accommodate the expanded populations of consolidated tribal groups, while maintaining the essential ritual elements that connected communities to their ancestral traditions. The preservation of traditional Sarmatian burial practices within Alanic cultural contexts demonstrates the systematic approach taken by Alanic leaders to maintain social stability during the process of political transformation. The Kurgan burial tradition continued under Alanic rule, but with modifications that reflected new political hierarchies and military organizations. Elite Alanic burials from the 3rd and 4th centuries contain traditional Sarmatian grave goods such as mirrors, jewellery and weapons, but arranged according to new symbolic systems that emphasized the integration of different cultural traditions within unified political structures. The linguistic evidence for the Alanic transformation reveals the gradual displacement of regional Sarmatian dialects by Alanic language varieties that became the standard for official communication and military commands throughout the Confederation. Personal names preserved in Greek and Latin, inscriptions from this period, show the increasing dominance of Alanic linguistic forms, though with persistent elements from earlier Sarmatian naming traditions that indicate the preservation of family lineages and clan identities within the new political framework. The linguistic changes occurred gradually over several generations, allowing for the maintenance of oral traditions and cultural knowledge while establishing new communication standards that facilitated political integration. The development of Alanic political institutions during this period created new mechanisms for managing the complex relationships between different ethnic groups and territorial units within the expanding confederation. The traditional Sarmatian system of autonomous tribal leaders was modified through the establishment of regional governors who answered directly to Alanic supreme commanders while maintaining authority over local populations. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres shows the construction of meeting halls and storage facilities that supported regular gatherings of regional leaders for coordination of military campaigns, distribution of tribute, and resolution of territorial disputes. The military innovations introduced during the Alanic transformation extended beyond improvements in weapons and tactics to include new approaches to logistics and campaign organisation that enhanced the effectiveness of large-scale military operations. The development of standardized equipment specifications allowed for more efficient production and maintenance of military supplies, while improved communication systems enabled better coordination between widely separated military units. Archaeological evidence from supply depots along major migration routes shows the establishment of cached weapons and equipment that could support extended military campaigns without requiring constant resupply from distant production centres. The expansion of Hellenic influence westward into the Dnieper River Valley brought them into direct contact with Gothic populations that had established themselves in former Scythian territories during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The initial encounters between Hellenic and Gothic forces occurred around 250 AD, when Hellenic cavalry units began conducting reconnaissance operations in preparation for larger territorial acquisitions. Archaeological evidence from border regions shows the construction of temporary fortifications and supply caches that indicate systematic military planning for extended operations in unfamiliar territories. The relationship between Hellenic confederations and Gothic kingdoms evolved through a series of military conflicts and diplomatic negotiations that established new territorial boundaries and political arrangements throughout the western steppes. The Gothic ability to field large infantry formations provided them with defensive capabilities that could counter Hellenic cavalry advantages under certain tactical conditions, leading to the development of new military strategies on both sides. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites shows the evolution of combined arms tactics that integrated cavalry and infantry operations in ways that maximized the strengths of each military system. The economic foundations of Hellenic power rested on their ability to control trade routes, connecting the Black Sea region with Central Asian and Chinese markets, that had become increasingly important during the 3rd century AD. The Hellenic position at the western terminus of the Silk Road trade networks provided them with access to luxury goods and manufactured items that could be distributed throughout their territories to maintain political loyalty and military effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from trading centres such as Tanais shows the expansion of commercial facilities and the construction of specialised storage buildings designed to handle increased volumes of long-distance trade goods. The integration of agricultural populations into Hellenic territorial systems represented a significant departure from traditional nomadic practices that reflected the changing economic and political circumstances of the late imperial period. The establishment of permanent settlements in river valleys provided Hellenic confederations with reliable sources of grain and other agricultural products that could support larger populations and more complex military organizations. Archaeological evidence from agricultural settlements in the Don and Kuban valleys shows the development of mixed farming systems that combined crop production with livestock management in ways that maintained essential elements of pastoral culture while providing economic diversification. The technological innovations achieved by Hellenic craftsmen during this period established new standards for metalworking and decorative arts that influenced cultural development throughout the region. The polychrome jewellery style that had characterised earlier Sarmatian elite culture was refined and expanded through the incorporation of new materials and techniques that created more complex and sophisticated decorative effects. Archaeological analysis of jewellery from Hellenic burial sites reveals the use of garnets, coloured glass, and precious metals in combination with traditional materials to create objects that demonstrated both technical skill and artistic innovation. The development of Hellenic artistic traditions represented a synthesis of inherited Sarmatian motifs with influences derived from contact with Roman, Persian, and Central Asian cultural traditions. The animal-style art that had been characteristic of steppe cultures was modified through the incorporation of new symbolic elements and decorative techniques that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Hellenic society. Bronze plaques and decorative fittings from this period show the continued use of traditional animal motifs, combined with geometric patterns and figural representations that demonstrate exposure to diverse artistic influences through expanded trade networks and diplomatic contacts. The religious syncretism that developed within Hellenic communities during the 3rd and 4th centuries created new spiritual traditions that combined traditional steppe beliefs with elements derived from Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and other religious systems encountered through territorial expansion and commercial contacts. archaeological evidence from religious sites shows the construction of new types of ceremonial buildings that incorporated architectural features from different cultural traditions, while maintaining essential elements of traditional fire worship and ancestor veneration. The religious innovations reflected the multicultural nature of Hellenic society, while providing spiritual frameworks that could unite diverse populations under common political authority. The consolidation of Hellenic power across the Pontic steppes during the late 3rd century AD coincided with the emergence of Gothic confederations as the dominant force in the territories between the Dniester and Dnieper rivers. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Chnyakov and Sintena de Mures reveals the establishment of Gothic settlements that combined agricultural production with craft specialization, creating economic foundations that could support large military forces and sustain territorial expansion. The material culture from these sites demonstrates Gothic adoption of Roman building techniques and pottery traditions while maintaining distinctive metalworking practices that reflected their Germanic cultural heritage. The first documented military encounters between Hellenic and Gothic forces occurred around 270 AD, when Hellenic reconnaissance units began probing Gothic defensive positions along the Dniester River valley. These initial contacts revealed fundamental differences in military organization and tactical doctrine that would shape subsequent conflicts between the two confederations. Gothic military forces consisted primarily of infantry formations armed with spears, shields, and swords, supported by limited numbers of cavalry units that lack the heavy armour and specialised equipment characteristic of Hellenic cataphracts. The Gothic emphasis on defensive warfare reflected their territorial objectives and agricultural economic base, which required the protection of fixed settlements and cultivated lands. The tactical challenges posed by Gothic military organisation forced Hellenic commanders to develop new approaches to cavalry warfare that could effectively engage infantry formations operating from prepared defensive positions. Traditional Sarmatian tactics had emphasised mobility and the exploitation of open terrain to achieve decisive cavalry charges, but Gothic defensive strategies involved the use of fortified settlements, earthwork barriers, and coordinated spear formations that neutralised many advantages of mounted warfare. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites near the Dniester reveals the development of new Hellenic tactical formations that integrated dismounted combat with traditional cavalry operations, allowing mounted warriors to engage enemy infantry on more equal terms. The evolution of Hellenic military equipment during this period reflected the need to adapt traditional steppe warfare methods to the challenges posed by Gothic defensive tactics. Weapon deposits from sites such as Novocherkassk contain examples of modified lance designs that featured reinforced points capable of penetrating shield walls and spear formations, while maintaining the length and balance necessary for effective mounted combat. The metallurgical analysis of these weapons reveals sophisticated forging techniques that created lance points with hardened tips and flexible shafts that could withstand the stresses of infantry combat without breaking during cavalry charges. The development of combined arms tactics represented a significant innovation in steppe military doctrine that emerged from the practical necessities of fighting Gothic infantry formations. Hellenic commanders learned to coordinate heavy cavalry charges with supporting attacks by light cavalry armed with composite bows, creating tactical combinations that could disrupt enemy formations before delivering decisive mounted assaults. Archaeological evidence from training areas near major Hellenic settlements shows the construction of practice facilities where cavalry units could rehearse complex maneuvers involving coordinated approaches, feigned retreats, and successive charge attacks that maximized the effectiveness of different types of mounted warriors. The diplomatic dimensions of Hellenic-Gothic relations involved complex negotiations that reflected the territorial ambitions of both confederations, while recognizing the military capabilities that each could bring to potential alliance arrangements. The Gothic kingdoms possessed superior capabilities for siege warfare and the defence of fortified positions, while Alanic confederations provided unmatched mobility and the ability to conduct rapid strategic movements across vast territories. The complementary nature of these military capabilities created opportunities for cooperation against common enemies, particularly the Roman Empire, which posed threats to the territorial expansion of both confederations. The first major Alanic-Gothic alliance was formed around 290 AD in response to Roman military operations aimed at reasserting imperial control over territories north of the Danube River. Archaeological evidence from Gothic settlements in Moldavia shows the presence of Alanic military equipment and burial practices, indicating the deployment of significant Alanic forces in support of Gothic territorial claims. The material culture from these sites demonstrates the development of hybrid military traditions that combined Gothic infantry tactics with Alanic cavalry operations, creating new forms of combined arms warfare that proved highly effective against Roman legionary formations. The joint Alanic Gothic raids against Roman Danubian provinces during the 290s represented the largest coordinated military operations undertaken by barbarian confederations since the Marcomannic Wars of the 2nd century AD. The strategic planning for these operations required extensive coordination between different tribal groups and the establishment of supply systems that could support military forces operating far from their traditional territories. Archaeological evidence from temporary camps along invasion routes reveals the construction of standardized defensive works and supply depots that demonstrate sophisticated logistical planning and military organization. The tactical coordination achieved during these joint operations involved the integration of Alanic heavy cavalry with Gothic infantry formations in ways that maximized the effectiveness of both military systems. Gothic spear formations provided defensive anchors that allowed Alanic cavalry to conduct charging attacks without fear of being outflanked or cut off from retreat routes, while Alanic mobility enabled Gothic forces to avoid unfavourable engagements and concentrate their strength at decisive points. The battlefield archaeology from sites such as Abritus reveals evidence of coordinated tactical formations that combine the strengths of different military traditions while minimizing their individual weaknesses. The success of early Alanic Gothic military cooperation encouraged the development of more permanent alliance structures that went beyond temporary agreements for specific military campaigns. The establishment of mixed settlements in border regions created new forms of political organization that combined elements of Gothic territorial governance with Alanic tribal leadership structures. Archaeological evidence from these settlements shows the development of hybrid material cultures that preserve distinctive elements of both traditions, while creating new synthetic forms that reflected the multicultural nature of these communities. The expansion of Alanic influence into Gothic territories proceeded through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation that reflected the practical realities of managing relationships between different cultural groups with competing territorial claims. Smaller Gothic communities that found themselves surrounded by Alanic populations often negotiated tributary relationships that preserved their local autonomy while acknowledging Alanic political supremacy. Archaeological evidence from these arrangements shows the continued production of Gothic-style pottery and metalwork, alongside the adoption of Alanic decorative motifs and burial practices. The integration of Gothic populations into Alanic political structures involved systematic efforts to preserve valuable elements of Gothic military and technological expertise while establishing new hierarchical relationships that reflected Alanic political dominance. Gothic craftsmen who possessed specialized knowledge of ironworking, agriculture, or fortification construction were often incorporated into Alanic communities where they could contribute their skills to collective military and economic activities. Workshop areas at major Alanic centres contain evidence of multi-ethnic craft production that combined Gothic technical knowledge with traditional Alanic artistic traditions. The religious syncretism that developed within mixed Alanic Gothic communities created new spiritual traditions that incorporated elements from both cultural backgrounds while maintaining essential characteristics that preserved distinct ethnic identities. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites shows the development of burial practices that combined Gothic grave goods with Alanic ritual elements, creating hybrid mortuary traditions that reflected the multicultural nature of these communities. The religious innovations included the adaptation of traditional Gothic ancestor veneration practices to accommodate Alanic fire worship and the development of new ceremonial contexts that could serve the spiritual needs of diverse populations. The emergence of Hunnic power in the eastern steppes during the 360 SAD created new strategic pressures that fundamentally altered the balance of power between Alanic and Gothic confederations. The initial Hunnic expansion westward displaced several smaller nomadic groups that had previously served as buffer populations between major tribal confederations, forcing direct confrontation between Hunnic forces and established Alanic territories. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Volga River shows evidence of violent destruction and population displacement that indicates the systematic nature of Hunnic territorial acquisition during this period. The military capabilities demonstrated by Hunnic forces represented significant innovations in steppe warfare that challenged traditional Alanic tactical superiority. Hunnic cavalry formations emphasized speed and archery over the heavy armor and lance combat that had characterized Alanic military doctrine, creating tactical advantages in situations where mobility and firepower could be more effectively employed than shock combat. The composite bows used by Hunnic warriors were superior to earlier steppe designs, featuring improved construction techniques that provided greater range and penetrating power against both armoured and unarmoured targets. The initial Alanic response to Hunnic expansion involved attempts to maintain traditional territorial boundaries through defensive strategies that emphasized the use of fortified positions and coordinated cavalry operations. Archaeological evidence from defensive works constructed during this period shows the adaptation of traditional Alanic military engineering to address the specific challenges posed by Hunnic tactical methods. The fortifications featured improved archery positions and obstacles designed to disrupt cavalry charges, while maintaining the mobility necessary for counterattacks by Alanic heavy cavalry formations. The failure of defensive strategies to halt Hunnic expansion forced Alanic leaders to reconsider their territorial objectives and military priorities during the 370 SAD. The archaeological record from this period shows evidence of systematic evacuation and the deliberate destruction of settlements that could not be effectively defended against Hunnic attacks. The material culture from abandoned sites reveals hasty burial of valuable objects and the removal of portable wealth, indicating organised withdrawal rather than chaotic flight in response to military pressure. The westward migration of Alanic populations under Hunnic pressure created new opportunities for alliance with Gothic confederations that face similar threats to their territorial integrity. The shared experience of Hunnic military pressure encouraged closer cooperation between Alanic and Gothic leaders, leading to the development of more integrated defensive strategies that combine the strengths of both military traditions. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased interaction between Alanic and Gothic communities, with material culture that demonstrates extensive cultural exchange and the development of hybrid technologies adapted to the challenges of confronting Hunnic military capabilities. The strategic coordination between Alanic and Gothic forces during the 370s involved the establishment of joint defensive positions that could effectively utilize the terrain advantages available in the region between the Dniester and Danube rivers. The defensive works constructed during this period combined Gothic expertise in fortification construction with Alanic knowledge of cavalry tactics, creating integrated defensive systems that could counter Hunnic mobility while providing bases for coordinated counterattacks. The archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated military engineering that incorporated multiple defensive lines, supply depots, and communication systems designed to support sustained resistance to Hunnic expansion. The impact of Hunnic pressure on traditional Alanic social organisation involved the breakdown of established territorial relationships and the emergence of new forms of political authority based on military effectiveness rather than hereditary status. The crisis conditions created by constant military pressure encouraged the rise of war leaders who could provide effective protection for their followers, regardless of their traditional position within established clan hierarchies. Archaeological evidence from this period shows changes in burial practices that reflect new forms of social organisation, with military equipment and symbols of authority distributed according to different criteria than had characterised earlier Alanic society. The fragmentation of Alanic political unity under Hunnic pressure resulted in the emergence of multiple competing leadership groups that pursued different strategies for dealing with the crisis. Some Alanic leaders attempted to negotiate tributary relationships with Hunnic overlords that would preserve elements of traditional autonomy while acknowledging Hunnic political supremacy. Archaeological evidence for these arrangements comes from sites where traditional Alanic material culture continues alongside the presence of Hunnic-style objects and burial practices, suggesting the maintenance of local communities under new political arrangements. Other Alanic groups chose to migrate westward into Roman territories, seeking imperial protection in exchange for military service and the acceptance of Roman political authority. The archaeological record of these migrations shows the movement of substantial populations with their livestock and portable possessions, indicating organised group movements rather than individual refugee flights. The material culture from early settlement sites in Roman territories demonstrates efforts to maintain traditional Alanic cultural practices while adapting to new environmental and political circumstances. The military service provided by migrating Alanic groups to Roman authorities represented a continuation of earlier patterns of barbarian integration into imperial military systems, but under circumstances that gave Alanic leaders greater negotiating power due to the military crisis facing the empire. The Alanic cavalry capabilities that had previously been employed as auxiliary forces now became essential components of Roman defensive strategies against Gothic and Hunnic threats. Archaeological evidence from military sites shows the rapid expansion of facilities for housing and equipping Alanic cavalry units, indicating the scale of their integration into Roman military operations. The settlement of Alanic populations in Gaul, Spain and North Africa during the late 4th and early 5th centuries created new centres of Alanic culture that preserved important elements of traditional steppe society while adapting to very different environmental and political conditions. The archaeological evidence from these settlements reveals innovative approaches to maintaining nomadic cultural practices within sedentary agricultural contexts, including the development of new forms of livestock management and the adaptation of traditional crafts to local materials and market conditions. The preservation of Alanic military traditions within these dispersed communities provided the foundation for their continued political importance throughout the period of barbarian migrations. Alanic cavalry units maintained their distinctive equipment and tactical methods while serving various Germanic kingdoms and the Roman Empire, contributing specialised military capabilities that remained valuable in the changing strategic environment of late antiquity. The material culture from military sites shows the continued production and use of traditional Alanic weapons and armour, indicating the persistence of specialised military knowledge, despite geographical dispersion and political fragmentation. The cultural continuity maintained by dispersed Alanic communities reflected deliberate efforts to preserve essential elements of traditional identity, while adapting to new circumstances that required significant modifications to establish social and economic practices. The linguistic evidence suggests that Alanic languages continued to be spoken within these communities for several generations, providing mechanisms for maintaining oral traditions and cultural knowledge that connected scattered populations to their common heritage. The religious practices documented at various settlement sites show the continuation of traditional fire worship and ancestor veneration, alongside the gradual adoption of Christian beliefs and practices. The catastrophic collapse of Hellenic resistance to Hunnic expansion in 375 AD triggered one of the most significant population movements in European history, as entire Hellenic confederations abandoned their traditional territories and joined the massive wave of barbarian migrations that would reshape the political landscape of the Western Roman Empire. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals the systematic abandonment of major Hellenic settlements along the Don and Kuban rivers, with excavations at sites such as Kupiakovo showing clear destruction layers followed by complete cessation of occupation. The material culture from these abandoned sites indicates hasty evacuation, with valuable objects buried in caches that were never recovered, suggesting the inhabitants expected to return but were prevented from doing so by the rapidly changing military situation. The integration of Hellenic forces into the Vandal Confederation under King Genseric represented one of the most successful adaptations of steppe military capabilities to the challenges of Western European warfare. The initial alliance between Hellenic warbands and Vandal tribal groups was forged during their joint crossing of the Rhine in 406 AD, when Hellenic heavy cavalry provided crucial protection for Vandal infantry formations during their passage through hostile Frankish territories. Archaeological evidence from temporary camps along the migration route shows the development of integrated defensive systems that combined Vandal expertise in fortification construction with Hellenic knowledge of mobile warfare tactics, creating new forms of military organisation that proved highly effective against both Roman and barbarian opponents. The tactical innovations that emerged from Hellenic-Vandal military cooperation involved the systematic integration of heavy cavalry operations with infantry formations in ways that maximised the effectiveness of both military systems. Hellenic cataphracts provided the shock capability necessary for breaking enemy formations, while Vandal infantry could exploit breakthroughs and hold captured positions against counterattacks. The weapon deposits from battlefield sites in Gaul contain examples of modified Hellenic equipment that had been adapted for combined operations, including shortened lances that could be more effectively employed in coordination with infantry formations and improved armour systems that provided protection against the different weapon types encountered in Western European warfare. The conquest of North Africa by the Vandal-Alan Confederation between 429 439 AD established the most enduring centre of Hellenic political power during the migration period. The strategic planning for the African expedition required extensive coordination between different tribal groups and the development of logistical systems capable of supporting military operations across the Mediterranean Sea. Archaeological evidence from ports along the Spanish coast reveals the construction of specialised facilities for building and maintaining the transport vessels necessary for moving large numbers of warriors, horses and equipment across the water barrier that had previously protected Roman Africa from barbarian invasion. The establishment of Hellenic communities in Tunisia and Algeria followed patterns that reflected both their nomadic heritage and the requirements of governing sedentary agricultural populations in an unfamiliar environment. The archaeological evidence from sites such as Hippo Regius and Thevesti shows the development of distinctive settlement patterns that combine traditional Hellenic livestock management practices with Mediterranean agricultural techniques. The material culture from these sites demonstrates the selective adoption of Roman building methods and pottery traditions, while maintaining essential elements of Hellenic decorative arts and metalworking to techniques that preserved cultural identity within the new territorial context. The political organisation of Alanic territories within the Vandal kingdom involved the preservation of traditional clan structures and leadership hierarchies, while adapting to the requirements of territorial administration and agricultural management. Alanic nobles maintained authority over their traditional followers, but were integrated into the broader Vandal administrative system through positions that combined military command with civilian governance responsibilities. Inscriptional evidence from North African cities reveals the existence of Hellenic officials with Latin titles, indicating the development of hybrid governmental systems that incorporated elements of both Germanic and steppe political traditions. The military contributions of Hellenic forces to Vandal naval operations represented a significant adaptation of traditional steppe warfare capabilities to maritime contexts. Alanic warriors served as marines aboard Vandal vessels, providing the boarding capabilities and close combat expertise necessary for naval warfare in the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from shipwreck sites contains examples of Alanic weapons and equipment that have been modified for naval use, including shortened swords and specialised armour systems that provided protection while allowing the mobility necessary for fighting aboard ships. The development of Hellenic cavalry tactics for operations in North African terrain required significant modifications to traditional steppe warfare methods that had been optimised for the grassland environments of the Pontic steppes. The desert and semi-desert conditions of much of Vandal territory demanded new approaches to horse management, logistics, and tactical deployment that took advantage of local environmental conditions, while maintaining the essential characteristics of mounted warfare. Archaeological evidence from military sites in the Atlas Mountain region shows the development of specialised facilities for maintaining cavalry forces in arid environments, including improved water storage systems and fodder production techniques adapted to local climate conditions. The religious syncretism that developed within Hellenic communities in North Africa reflected the complex cultural environment of the region, where traditional Hellenic beliefs encountered not only Roman Christianity, but also indigenous Berber spiritual traditions and residual influences from earlier Carthaginian religious practices. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites shows the development of burial practices that combine traditional Hellenic grave goods with local customs and Christian symbols, creating hybrid mortuary traditions that reflected the multicultural nature of Vandal North Africa. Fire altars discovered at settlement sites demonstrate the continuation of traditional Hellenic religious practices alongside the gradual adoption of Christian beliefs and architectural forms. The preservation of Hellenic linguistic traditions within North African communities is evidenced by personal names and inscriptions that maintain characteristic Hellenic phonological features despite the gradual adoption of Latin for official and commercial purposes. The onomastic evidence suggests that Hellenic languages continue to be spoken within family contexts for several generations after the conquest, providing mechanisms for maintaining oral traditions and cultural knowledge that connected North African Hellenic communities to their steppe heritage. The linguistic borrowings that appear in local Latin dialects include terms related to horse management and military organisation that reflect the specialised knowledge contributed by Hellenic populations to the broader Vandal cultural synthesis. The economic integration of Hellenic communities into North African commercial networks involved the adaptation of traditional pastoral practices to Mediterranean market conditions and the development of new forms of specialised production that took advantage of Hellenic technical expertise. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites shows the continued production of traditional Hellenic metalwork and decorative objects, alongside the development of new craft traditions that combined steppe techniques with local materials and artistic influences. The horse breeding programs established by Hellenic communities in suitable regions of North Africa produced animals that were highly valued for military purposes and provided an important source of income that facilitated the maintenance of traditional cultural practices. The establishment of Alanic settlements in Gaul occurred under very different circumstances from their integration into the Vandal kingdom, as individual war bands and family groups sought accommodation with various Roman authorities and Germanic kingdoms that controlled different regions of the former province. The archaeological evidence from sites in the Loire Valley and southern Gaul reveals the development of small-scale agricultural communities that preserved essential elements of Alanic culture while adapting to local environmental conditions and political arrangements. The material culture from these settlements shows the selective adoption of Gallo-Roman building techniques and pottery traditions while maintaining distinctive Alanic metalworking practices and decorative motifs. The military service provided by Alanic groups to various Gallic authorities represented a continuation of their traditional role as specialized cavalry forces, but under circumstances that required adaptation to the complex political landscape of post-Roman Gaul. Alanic cavalry units served the Visigothic kingdom, various Roman commanders, and emerging Frankish powers, providing specialized military capabilities in exchange for land grants and political protection. Archaeological evidence from military sites shows the continued use of traditional Alanic weapons and equipment alongside the gradual adoption of Germanic and Roman military technologies that enhanced their effectiveness in Western European warfare contexts. The integration of Alanic populations into Visigothic territories in Spain and southern Gaul created new forms of cultural synthesis that combined elements of steppe, Germanic, and Roman traditions within unified political structures. The archaeological evidence from mixed settlements reveals the development of hybrid material cultures that preserve distinctive elements of each tradition, while creating new synthetic forms adapted to local conditions. The pottery assemblages from these sites show the influence of Alanic decorative traditions on local ceramic production, while metalwork demonstrates the continued use of traditional Alanic techniques alongside the adoption of Visigothic and Roman technological innovations. The political organisation of Alanic communities within Visigothic territories involved the preservation of traditional clan leadership structures while accepting integration into the broader Germanic administrative system. Alanic nobles maintained authority over their followers, but were required to provide military service to Visigothic kings and participate in the territorial governance systems that controlled local populations. The legal evidence from Visigothic law codes reveals provisions for managing relationships between different ethnic groups, including specific regulations governing Alanic property rights, marriage customs, and military obligations that recognize their distinct cultural identity while ensuring political integration. The religious transformation of Alanic communities in Visigothic territories reflected the complex theological environment of the period, where traditional Alanic beliefs encountered both Catholic and Arian Christianity alongside residual Roman pagan practices. Archaeological evidence from church sites shows the development of architectural forms that incorporated traditional Alanic decorative elements within Christian religious contexts, creating hybrid sacred spaces that serve the spiritual needs of multicultural congregations. The gradual conversion of Alanic populations to Christianity proceeded alongside the preservation of traditional customs and practices that were adapted to Christian theological frameworks rather than completely abandoned. The settlement of Alanic groups in the Suevi kingdom of northwestern Spain created another distinct centre of Alanic culture that developed under different political and environmental conditions from their communities in North Africa and southern Gaul. The archaeological evidence from sites in Galicia and northern Portugal shows the development of agricultural settlements that combine traditional Alanic livestock management practices with local farming techniques adapted to the Atlantic climate and mountainous terrain. The material culture from these sites demonstrates the selective adoption of local building materials and construction techniques while maintaining essential elements of Alanic decorative arts and craft traditions. The military contributions of Alanic forces to Suevi military operations involved the adaptation of traditional cavalry tactics to the challenges of warfare in mountainous terrain against both Roman forces and other barbarian groups. The tactical modifications required for effective cavalry operations in the Iberian Peninsula included the development of new approaches to logistics and supply that could maintain mounted forces in regions where traditional steppe warfare methods were less applicable. Archaeological evidence from military sites shows the continued use of traditional Alaenic weapons alongside the adoption of local weapon types that were better suited to the specific tactical requirements of Iberian warfare. The gradual loss of distinct Alaenic ethnic identity during the 5th and 6th centuries resulted from the combined effects of geographical dispersion, intermarriage with other populations, and the adoption of local cultural practices that gradually replaced traditional steppe customs. The archaeological record from this period shows the increasing integration of Alaenic material culture elements into broader regional traditions, with distinctive Alaenic decorative motifs and technical practices becoming part of the general cultural repertoire of various European regions, rather than markers of specific ethnic identity. The process of cultural assimilation proceeded at different rates in different locations, depending on local circumstances and the degree of contact with other Alaenic communities. The preservation of Alaenic cultural elements within the broader European cultural synthesis of the early medieval period contributed important innovations to military technology, decorative arts, and livestock management that influenced regional development long after distinct Alaenic political entities had ceased to exist. The archaeological evidence for these contributions includes the widespread adoption of improved cavalry equipment designs, the integration of steppe decorative motifs into local artistic traditions, and the development of new approaches to horse breeding that enhanced the military capabilities of various European kingdoms. The technical knowledge preserved in these innovations represented the distillation of centuries of steppe cultural development that continued to influence European civilization even after its original cultural context had been transformed beyond recognition. The linguistic legacy of Alaenic populations in Western Europe is preserved in place names, personal names, and loanwords that entered local languages during the migration period and continued to be used long after the original speakers had been assimilated into other populations. The toponymic evidence includes numerous place names throughout France, Spain, and North Africa that derive from Alaenic linguistic roots, indicating the widespread distribution of Alaenic settlements and their integration into local geographical nomenclature. The personal names preserved in medieval documents show the continuation of Alaenic naming traditions within families that maintained awareness of their steppe heritage even after adopting local cultural practices and political allegiances. The archaeological evidence for Alaenic settlements across Western Europe reveals the development of distinctive material culture traditions that combined elements from their steppe heritage with influences from the various cultural environments they encountered during their migrations. The pottery traditions developed in these communities show the adaptation of traditional Alaenic ceramic techniques to local clay sources and firing methods, creating regional variations that maintained essential characteristics while incorporating new decorative elements and functional features. The metalworking traditions demonstrate similar patterns of cultural adaptation, with traditional Alaenic techniques for producing weapons and decorative objects modified to work with different raw materials and adapted to local aesthetic preferences and functional requirements. The dissolution of the last recognizable Sarmatian Alan political entities during the 6th century AD marked the end of nearly a millennium of steppe dominance across the Pontic regions, yet their cultural and genetic legacy had already become deeply embedded within the emerging medieval European civilization. The final Alaenic principalities along the northern Caucasus foothills, which had maintained semi-autonomous status under successive waves of Hunnic, Avar, and early Turkic overlordship, were gradually absorbed into the expanding sphere of Byzantine influence an emerging Khazar power during the 630-650 SAD. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Zmayskaya and Alkan Kala reveals the systematic transformation of traditional Alanic settlement patterns, with the construction of stone fortifications using Byzantine architectural techniques alongside the maintenance of traditional Alanic craft workshops and burial practices that preserved essential elements of steppe cultural identity. The linguistic legacy of the Sarmatian Alanic peoples extends far beyond the immediate geographical boundaries of their historical territories, permeating the vocabulary and place name systems of regions across Europe where their populations had settled during the migration period. In France, the concentration of Alanic toponyms in the Loire Valley and Armorican Peninsula reflects the systematic settlement of Alanic populations during the 5th century, with place names such as Alaines, Alincourt and Alainville preserving the ethnic designation of their founders in forms that demonstrate the phonological evolution of Alanic linguistic elements within Romance language contexts. The survival of these toponyms through subsequent periods of political change and population movement indicates the substantial demographic impact of Alanic settlement and the persistence of local traditions that maintained awareness of their historical origins. The preservation of Alanic personal names within medieval European naming systems provides crucial evidence for the continued cultural influence of Sarmatian populations long after their political independence had ended. The name Alan itself became widely adopted across Western Europe, appearing in royal genealogies and aristocratic family traditions that claimed descent from Alanic warrior elites. In Brittany, the popularity of Alanic names such as Alan, Alan and their derivatives reflects not merely fashion, but genuine genealogical connections to Alanic settler populations whose descendants maintained positions of local prominence. The onomastic evidence from medieval charters and chronicles reveals the systematic preservation of Alanic naming traditions within specific family lineages that served as repositories of cultural memory and ethnic identity. The linguistic borrowings that entered various European languages during the migration period include technical terms related to military equipment, horse management, and pastoral practices that reflect the specialized knowledge contributed by Sarmatian Alanic populations to medieval European civilization. In medieval Latin texts, words such as contus for the long lance and cataphractus for heavily armoured cavalry demonstrate the adoption of Sarmatian military terminology into the standard vocabulary of European warfare. The Romance languages preserve numerous loanwords related to horse breeding and cavalry equipment that derive from Alanic linguistic sources, indicating the continued importance of Sarmatian expertise in these specialised areas throughout the early medieval period. The cultural contributions of Sarmatian Alanic populations to medieval European military development extended beyond terminology to include fundamental innovations in cavalry tactics, armour design, and horse breeding that transformed the nature of European warfare. The heavy cavalry formations that became characteristic of medieval European armies owed crucial technical elements to Sarmatian cataphract traditions, particularly the development of coordinated charge tactics and the integration of lance combat with armoured protection for both rider and mount. Archaeological evidence from early medieval weapon deposits across Europe reveals the continued production and use of lance designs that derive directly from Sarmatian prototypes, with metallurgical techniques and decorative elements that demonstrate the preservation of steppe military traditions within European contexts. The evolution of medieval European armour systems incorporated numerous technical innovations that originated in Sarmatian workshops and were transmitted through the networks of cultural exchange established during the migration period. The scale armour construction techniques that had been perfected by Sarmatian craftsmen provided the foundation for the development of more sophisticated protection systems, including the laminated armour designs that became characteristic of Byzantine and early medieval European military equipment. The manufacturing processes developed for producing these armour systems required specialised metallurgical knowledge that was preserved within craft traditions maintained by descendants of Sarmatian populations who had settled in various European regions. The influence of Sarmatian artistic traditions on medieval European decorative arts created distinctive regional styles that combined steppe animal motifs with local artistic preferences and Christian religious symbolism. The polychrome jewellery style that had characterised Sarmatian elite culture was adapted and transformed within European contexts, contributing to the development of the cloison and garnet inlay techniques that became hallmarks of early medieval European metalwork. Archaeological analysis of jewellery from Merovingian and Visigothic burial sites reveals technical processes and decorative elements that demonstrate direct continuity with Sarmatian artistic traditions, indicating the preservation of specialised craft knowledge within European workshops. The animal style art that had been central to Sarmatian cultural expression underwent systematic transformation within Christian European contexts, with traditional motifs adapted to serve new symbolic functions while maintaining essential aesthetic characteristics. The stylized animal representations that appear in medieval European manuscript illumination, metalwork and stone carving demonstrate the integration of steppe artistic traditions with Christian iconographic programs. The technical skills required to create these hybrid artistic forms were preserved within monastic scriptoriums and secular workshops that maintained connections to the oral traditions and craft techniques transmitted by Sarmatian populations. The religious syncretism that had characterized Sarmatian spiritual traditions contributed important elements to the development of medieval European Christianity, particularly in regions where substantial Sarmatian populations had settled during the migration period. The fire worship practices that had been central to Sarmatian religious life were adapted within Christian contexts through the emphasis on sacred flames and candle lighting that became characteristic of medieval European liturgical practices. Archaeological evidence from early medieval church sites reveals the construction of specialized areas for maintaining perpetual flames and the incorporation of fire altars into Christian sacred architecture in ways that reflect the influence of traditional Sarmatian religious practices. The veneration of warrior saints that became prominent in medieval European Christianity demonstrates the influence of Sarmatian cultural values on the development of Christian spiritual traditions. The emphasis on military virtue and the sanctification of warfare that characterized medieval European religious thought reflected the integration of steppe warrior ethics with Christian theological frameworks. The hagiographical traditions that developed around figures such as Saint Martin of Tours and St. Maurice incorporated elements that derive from Sarmatian concepts of sacred warfare and the spiritual significance of military service, creating hybrid religious traditions that serve the needs of populations with diverse cultural backgrounds. The horse breeding programs established by Sarmatian populations in various European regions contributed crucial genetic stock and management techniques that enhanced the quality of medieval European cavalry mounts. The larger, more powerful horses that had been developed for Sarmatian cataphract warfare provided the foundation for breeding programs that produced the destriers and other specialized war horses that became essential for medieval European heavy cavalry operations. Archaeological evidence from medieval horse burials reveals animals with physical characteristics that demonstrate the continued influence of Sarmatian breeding traditions, including the size, bone structure, and muscular development that had been optimized for carrying heavily armored warriors. The pastoral management techniques developed by Sarmatian populations during their centuries of nomadic life contributed important innovations to medieval European agricultural practices, particularly in regions where traditional farming methods were inadequate for local environmental conditions. The integration of livestock management with crop production that had characterized settled Sarmatian communities provided models for agricultural diversification that enhanced the productivity and sustainability of medieval European farming systems. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals the adoption of Sarmatian techniques for managing mixed herds, processing dairy products, and maintaining genetic diversity within livestock populations. The fortification techniques that had been developed by Sarmatian communities for defending their settlements against nomadic raiders were adapted and integrated into medieval European defensive architecture. The earthwork construction methods and the strategic placement of defensive works that characterized Sarmatian military engineering provided valuable precedents for the development of motte and bailey castles and other fortification systems that became characteristic of medieval European defensive architecture. Archaeological analysis of early medieval fortifications reveals construction techniques and defensive features that demonstrate the influence of Sarmatian military engineering knowledge on European fortress design. Modern archaeological discoveries have fundamentally transformed scholarly understanding of Sarmatian influence on medieval European development through the systematic excavation of sites that reveal the extent and nature of cultural continuity between steppe and European traditions. The excavation of the Novgorod birchbark documents has revealed Alanic personal names and linguistic elements within medieval Russian contexts that demonstrate the continued presence and influence of Sarmatian populations in Eastern European regions long after their political independence had ended. The material culture from these sites shows the preservation of traditional Sarmatian craft techniques and decorative motifs within medieval Slavic cultural contexts. The analysis of medieval European burial sites using modern osteological and genetic techniques has revealed the demographic impact of Sarmatian migration and settlement throughout Europe. The isotope analysis of skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries has identified individuals with childhood signatures consistent with steppe environments, indicating the continued migration and settlement of populations from Sarmatian territories well into the medieval period. The genetic analysis of these populations reveals the preservation of Central Asian and steppe genetic markers within European populations, demonstrating the biological legacy of Sarmatian settlement and intermarriage with local populations. The scholarly debates surrounding Sarmatian influence on medieval European knightly culture have been enriched by new archaeological evidence that reveals the technical and cultural continuities between steppe warrior traditions and European chivalric practices. The excavation of early medieval weapon deposits has revealed lance designs, armour construction techniques, and horse equipment that demonstrate direct technological continuity with Sarmatian military traditions. The analysis of medieval European military manuals and treatises reveals tactical concepts and training methods that show the influence of steppe warfare traditions on the development of European cavalry doctrine. The investigation of medieval European horse culture through archaeological and documentary evidence has revealed the extensive influence of Sarmatian breeding programs and management techniques on the development of European cavalry capabilities. The analysis of medieval horse remains reveals breeding practices that demonstrate the continued application of Sarmatian genetic selection principles and management techniques that had been developed for producing superior cavalry mounts. The documentary evidence from medieval horse breeding establishments reveals the preservation of Sarmatian terminology and technical knowledge within European equestrian traditions. The cultural memory of Sarmatian warrior traditions persisted within medieval European literary and historical traditions through chronicles, genealogies, and legendary narratives that preserved awareness of their historical significance. Medieval European chroniclers maintained records of Alanic settlements and military contributions that demonstrate the continued recognition of their cultural distinctiveness and historical importance. The preservation of these traditions within medieval European historical consciousness reflects the lasting impact of Sarmatian cultural contributions on European civilization. The transformation of Sarmatian cultural elements within medieval European contexts created new synthetic traditions that preserved essential characteristics while adapting to changed political and social circumstances. The integration of Sarmatian military techniques with European feudal structures created new forms of cavalry organisation that combined the mobility and shock capabilities of steppe warfare with the territorial and political requirements of medieval European society. The adaptation of Sarmatian craft traditions to European market conditions and aesthetic preferences created regional specializations that maintained technical excellence while serving new cultural functions. The final dissolution of distinct Sarmatian cultural identity occurred through the gradual process of assimilation and cultural transformation that integrated their populations and traditions into the broader tapestry of medieval European civilization. By the 7th century AD, the last communities that maintained recognizable Sarmatian cultural practices had either been absorbed into emerging medieval kingdoms or had evolved into new ethnic identities that preserved selected elements of their steppe heritage within transformed cultural contexts. The Ossetian people of the Caucasus represent the most direct descendants of the Sarmatian Alanic populations, maintaining linguistic and cultural traditions that provide crucial insights into the nature of ancient steppe civilization. The legacy of the Sarmatians thus extends far beyond their historical period of political dominance, permeating the foundations of medieval European civilization through contributions to military technology, artistic traditions, religious practices, and agricultural techniques that continue to influence European development for centuries after their distinct political entities had ceased to exist. Their transformation from nomadic steppe warriors into integral components of European medieval society represents one of the most successful examples of cultural adaptation and integration in human history, demonstrating the dynamic nature of cultural identity and the enduring influence of technological and social innovations across temporal and geographical boundaries.